A nearly $5 million Bugatti. Stone dead. Won't even whisper. 3 days. Factory engineers flown in from Europe. Electrical specialists with equipment worth more than most people's houses. The finest diagnostic minds in the automotive world. All of them standing around a machine worth more than a small neighborhood, completely stumped. Then a man walked in carrying a dented red toolbox that looked older than he did. No credentials on the wall, no company badge, just a quiet guy who fixed ordinary cars for ordinary people. He asked for 5 minutes. What happened next left every expert in that room speechless. If stories like this move you, real, human, unexpected, subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, this one's worth every minute. The Whitmore Automotive Group occupied a full city block in the kind of neighborhood where the buildings themselves seemed to understand they were important. Floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, temperature-controlled bays that smelled faintly of rubber and expensive ambition. It was the sort of place where people didn't just buy cars, they acquired them, the way collectors acquired art or silence or proof of their own success. Celeste Whitmore had built it that way on purpose. She was 30 years old, which was the detail people always mentioned first, usually with a particular mixture of admiration and resentment they couldn't quite disguise. 30 years old and already running a company her grandfather had started, her father had grown, and which she had transformed into something neither of them would have fully recognized. She had taken the family dealership network and pushed it into the hypercar space, limited production vehicles, private acquisition services, a clientele who measured car prices the way most people measured grocery bills, casually and without real concern. She wore her success the way she wore her clothes, precisely, intentionally, without apology. But on this particular Tuesday morning, standing in the primary service bay with her arms folded and her jaw tight, Celeste Whitmore looked like someone who hadn't slept well in 3 days. Because she hadn't. The Bugatti sat in the center of the bay like a piece of sculpture that had forgotten what it was supposed to do. It was a Bugatti Tourbillon, one of fewer than 250 units allocated worldwide, finished in a deep midnight blue that shifted toward violet under certain lights. The interior was hand-stitched in a pale cream leather that had been ordered separately and installed by a craftsman in Lyon who had a 4-year waiting list. The client who had purchased it was a private equity manager named Gerald Forsyth, a man who had very specifically told Celeste's sales director that he intended to drive it to his lake house the following weekend, and that he required everything to be, and this was his exact word, seamless. Gerald Forsyth was not going to his lake house this weekend. The car had been delivered to the service center 3 days ago for a routine pre-delivery inspection, the careful final check that Whitmore performed on every vehicle before it transferred to a client. Software verification, fluid checks, a full systems review. The kind of procedure her team had performed hundreds of times without incident, except this time the Bugatti had not started. Not a hesitation, not a rough idle, not a warning light that needed interpretation. The car had simply sat there and refused, completely and without explanation, to do the one thing it existed to do. The first 12 hours had been almost manageable. Marcus Okafor, Celeste's head of technical services, was a careful, methodical man who had spent 22 years in high-performance automotive work and who did not panic easily. When the initial start attempt failed, he ran the diagnostic sequence himself, reviewed the output with 2 of his senior technicians, and concluded that they were probably looking at a communication fault between the primary ECU and the startup authorization module. Probably, he had told Celeste, using the word deliberately, the way a doctor uses it when they mean, "I'm not ready to commit to anything yet." He ordered the system reset, ran it again, then a second time. The car didn't start. By hour 18, Marcus had called the Bugatti factory technical support line and spent 2 hours on the phone with an engineer in Molsheim who had walked him through every diagnostic protocol in the service manual, including 3 that Marcus had already tried. The car still didn't start. By the end of the first full day, Celeste had made 3 decisions in quick succession. She had personally called Gerald Forsyth to explain that there would be a short delay. She had agreed to extend him a complimentary loaner from the collection at no cost for as long as necessary. And she had contacted Bugatti North America to request factory technical support. Not a phone consultation, but actual engineers, in person, on-site, immediately. Gerald Forsyth had been polite on the phone, professionally polite. The kind of polite that suggested he was keeping a detailed account. The Bugatti factory engineers arrived the following morning. Two of them, a man named Dominic, who had an accent that moved between French and German depending on his level of irritation, and a woman named Petra who said very little but who moved around the car with a focused proprietary authority that made Marcus's technicians instinctively step back. They brought their own equipment, proprietary diagnostic hardware that connected to the car's systems in ways Marcus's tools couldn't access. They worked for the better part of 6 hours, running sequences and pulling data and having low, rapid conversations with each other in what Marcus suspected was a private technical shorthand built over years of working together. At the end of those 6 hours, Dominic came to find Celeste in her office. He sat down across from her desk, which was not something she had invited him to do, and he folded his hands and he said, "Ms. Whitmore, this vehicle has an anomaly that we have not previously encountered in production units." Celeste studied him. "Can you fix it?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. "We are continuing our analysis." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "We believe the fault is systemic and may require the vehicle to be returned to the factory for full diagnostic access." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said very evenly, "That car is supposed to be delivered to a client in 4 days. Returning it to France would take weeks. That is not an acceptable outcome." Dominic nodded in a way that suggested he understood the situation perfectly while simultaneously communicating that understanding it did not change it. He went back to work. By the end of day 2, the factory engineers had been joined by an independent electrical systems specialist named Dr. Raymond Holt, who came with significant professional reputation and a billing rate that Celeste did not bother to question. Dr. Holt spent 4 hours reviewing the factory team's diagnostic data, asked for a further 2 hours alone with the vehicle, and then delivered his assessment. The fault pattern was consistent with a cascade failure in the vehicle's high-voltage communication architecture, which would require systematic isolation testing of each node in the network. "How long?" Celeste asked. "Done properly?" "Week and a half, maybe 2. She thanked him. She went back to her office. She sat at her desk for a long moment, staring at the Bugatti on the service bay camera feed on her monitor. Then she picked up the phone and called a man named Ronan Vale. Ronan Vale was 61 years old and semi-retired, which in his case meant he worked when he felt like it and charged accordingly. He had spent the better part of 4 decades as a specialist in high-performance European automotive systems, had consulted for racing teams, had been flown to 3 different countries to diagnose problems that local engineers couldn't solve, and had a reputation in certain circles that was built entirely on results and contained not a single unnecessary word. He arrived at the Whitmore Center the following morning carrying a single soft bag and wearing an expression that suggested he had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. He spent 12 hours with the Bugatti. He reviewed every piece of diagnostic data the factory engineers had generated. He examined Dr. Holt's analysis. He ran his own sequences, isolated his own test parameters, worked through his own methodical progression of possibilities with the quiet, unhurried patience of a man who knew that shortcuts in this kind of work always cost more time than they saved. Celeste checked the bay cameras periodically throughout the day. Ronan Vale moved around the car like a man having a very long private conversation with something that wasn't talking back. At 7:15 in the evening, he came upstairs. He sat across from Celeste's desk, again without being asked, and he rubbed his face with both hands in a way that told her everything before he said a word. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said. "I don't know." Celeste absorbed that. Coming from Ronan Vale, those 3 words represented something significant. "I've eliminated every failure mode I can identify from the data available," he continued. "The fault is real. The systems are genuinely not communicating, but I cannot locate the source. Whatever is causing it is either outside my diagnostic access with available equipment, or it's something I haven't seen before and I'm not recognizing." He paused. "I'm sorry. I don't say that often." "I know," Celeste said. He named a figure for his time. She paid it without negotiation because that was the arrangement she'd agreed to, and because Ronan Vale being unable to solve a problem still meant something. It meant the problem was genuinely serious. After he left, she sat alone in her office for a long time. The Bugatti sat 2 floors below her, worth $4,900,000, and completely useless. Marcus knocked on her office door at 8:40 the next morning and leaned against the frame in that careful way he had when he was bringing information he wasn't sure how she'd receive. "There's a guy downstairs," he said. "Says he's heard about the car." Celeste looked up from the cost scenario spreadsheet she'd been staring at. "What kind of guy?" Marcus considered this question for a moment. "The neighborhood kind. He has a shop about 6 blocks over. Does regular maintenance, older vehicles, a few classic restorations." He paused. "He's got a toolbox that looks like it survived a war." "Why is he here?" "Says he thinks he might know what's wrong." A silence settled over the office. Through the glass wall, Celeste could see the service bay below, where the Bugatti sat with a kind of patient indifference that was beginning to feel personal. "Marcus," she said carefully, "we have had factory engineers from France, an independent specialist with a doctoral degree, and Ronan Vale. Ronan Vale couldn't fix it." "I know. And you're telling me a neighborhood mechanic walked in off the street and thinks he can?" "That's more or less the situation, yeah." She looked at him for a moment. "Send him up." Evan Calder did not look like a man who fixed $5 million cars. That was simply the truth of it, and it was the first thing you noticed, and it was also, Celeste would eventually understand, entirely the point. He was 32, with the kind of face that looked like it had spent a lot of time outdoors in all kinds of weather. Not dramatically, just honestly, the way working faces look. His clothes were clean but carried the permanent faint suggestion of motor oil the way a carpenter's hands carry wood dust. He was carrying, as Marcus had indicated, a toolbox, red metal dented along one corner in a way that suggested it had been dropped from a height more than once. That looked like it might have been new sometime in the mid-1980s. He shook Celeste's hand with a directness that she appreciated, because she had met enough people in this business who shook hands like they were auditioning for something. "Evan Calder," he said. "I do general repair work over on Ashford. One of your service guys is a regular customer. His wife drives an old Corolla, brings it in every few months. He mentioned the car situation." "You've heard of the Bugatti situation?" "Yeah." He said it simply, not boastfully, just confirming a fact. "I've been thinking about it for about 2 days, off and on." Celeste gestured toward the chair across from her desk. He sat, setting the toolbox on the floor beside him, and she noticed he didn't fidget with it or apologize for it or make any kind of gesture acknowledging that it looked out of place in her office. It was his toolbox, and he was here, and those were just facts. "I want to ask you something before we go any further," she said. "Not to be unkind. Genuinely. What makes you think you can find something that Ronan Vale couldn't find?" Evan was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, just thinking. "I don't know that I can," he said, "but I think there's a specific type of thing that the people who've looked at this car might have gotten wrong. And if I'm right about what type it is, then it's the kind of thing that's almost impossible to find with sophisticated equipment, because sophisticated equipment is built to look for sophisticated problems." Celeste studied him. "Explain that." "Everyone who's worked on that car," Evan said, "is a specialist. And specialists are trained to find complex failures because complex failures are what justifies bringing in specialists. But sometimes a car doesn't start because of something simple that got ignored at exactly the moment when everyone assumed someone else had already checked it." He paused. "I could be completely wrong, but I'd like 10 minutes with it if you'll allow it." Celeste thought about Gerald Forsythe's professionally polite phone voice. She thought about the number at the bottom of the cost scenario spreadsheet. She thought about Ronan Vale rubbing his face with both hands at 7:15 the previous evening. "5 minutes," she said. "That's fine," Evan said. The walk down to the service bay with a stranger who carried an antique toolbox was not something Celeste Whitmore had planned for this week. The technicians and engineers who were still working on site paused in what they were doing as Evan entered the bay. Some of them recognized the toolbox before they registered the man, and their expressions shifted through a sequence: curiosity, assessment, and then, from a few of the younger ones, something that wasn't quite contempt but was related to it. Dr. Raymond Holt was still present, reviewing data on a laptop at a workstation near the far wall. He looked up as Evan entered, took in the full picture in about half a second, and returned to his screen without comment. Dominic, one of the Bugatti factory engineers, was on a phone call near the bay door. He glanced over, and the glance said everything a comment would have said without the inconvenience of being on the record. Evan didn't seem to notice any of it, or if he did, he'd decided it wasn't relevant information. He walked to the car and stopped about 3 feet from it and just stood there. Not circling it, not reaching for it, just looking at it the way you look at something you're trying to understand before you touch it. "Can somebody tell me the exact sequence of events?" he said. "Not the diagnostic results, the sequence of events. What happened to this car, in order, before it stopped starting?" Marcus, who was standing to Celeste's left, answered. "Pre-delivery inspection. Software update was pushed as part of the standard protocol. After the update was completed, the car was moved to the static bay for the final systems check, and when they went to start it for the road test confirmation, nothing." Evan nodded slowly. "When you say the software update was completed, how was that confirmed?" "The diagnostic interface showed successful completion." "Did anyone physically inspect the connection points used during the update process? The actual connector interfaces?" A pause. Marcus looked at the two factory engineers who were now both listening. Dominic had ended his phone call. "The diagnostic confirmation is the verification protocol," Dominic said from across the bay. His voice had the particular texture of a man explaining something he expected not to need to explain. "If the interface shows successful completion, the update is complete. That's the design system." "Right," Evan said. "I understand that's the protocol." He paused. "But did anyone physically look at the connectors afterward?" It was not quite a question. It was more like a statement with a pause at the end. Nobody answered. Evan crouched down beside the front driver's side of the vehicle and looked at Marcus. "There's an access panel on this model. I've been reading the service documentation for about 2 days. Can someone give me access to it? I need to see the communication connector cluster for the startup authorization network." Marcus looked at Celeste. She gave him a small nod. The panel took 3 minutes to open. It required a specific sequence tool that one of Marcus's technicians retrieved from the cabinet, and during those 3 minutes the bay was notably quiet. Even Dr. Holt had turned from his laptop. Evan crouched in front of the open panel with a small flashlight, not a professional inspection light, just a regular flashlight, and looked at what was inside for a long time without touching anything. Then he said quietly, "There it is." "There what is?" Celeste moved closer. "Hand me a 3.5mm alignment pick," Evan said to nobody in particular. One of the technicians, the youngest one, who had been watching with a kind of focused disbelief, retrieved it from Evan's red toolbox and handed it over without being asked twice. "This connector," Evan said, pointing with the pick at a component that looked, to Celeste's eyes, like approximately 40 other components in the same cluster. "This is the primary communication line between the startup authorization module and the main control bus. See this tab here, along the upper edge?" Celeste leaned in. She could see it. A small plastic alignment tab, the kind of feature built into connector housings to ensure they seated correctly and completely. It was broken. Not shattered, just snapped at the base, cleanly, the way plastic breaks when it encounters force at the wrong angle. "That tab," Evan said, "is what holds the connector fully seated. Without it, the connector looks connected. It sits in the housing. The outer housing looks flush. The diagnostic interface gets a signal. But the internal pin contact isn't fully engaged. The signal gets through enough to tell the software that the update completed. But not enough. And not consistently enough. For the startup authorization to actually work." Dominic had crossed the bay and was crouching beside Evan now, looking at the same thing. His face was doing something complicated. "This is consistent with the fault pattern," Petra said from behind them. Her first extended contribution to any conversation in 3 days. "The inconsistent communication dropout. This explains it." "What broke the tab?" Marcus asked. "Probably whoever seated the connector during the update installation," Evan said. "If you're moving fast, if the angle's slightly off, these tabs can go without you feeling it. And then the housing still looks like it's seated because it sits flush without the tab. Nobody checks it. Because the tab is inside the housing, you can't see it without taking the panel off and using a light." He paused. "And nobody takes the panel off because the diagnostic interface says everything's fine." The bay was very quiet. Dr. Holt had left his laptop and was standing at the edge of the group. His expression was difficult to read. Not embarrassed exactly, but careful in the way of a man who is deciding how to process new information. I can fix this, Evan said to Celeste. I need to reseat this connector properly and add a retention solution that doesn't depend on the tab. It's about 5 minutes of actual work. The panel reassembly takes another few minutes after that. Celeste looked at him, then at the connector, then at the 12 faces of engineers and technicians standing in various configurations around the bay. Do it, she said. Evan worked without ceremony, which was the only way he knew how to work. He pulled from the red toolbox a small collection of items that looked entirely unimpressive. A connector retention clip of the correct gauge, adhesive-backed insulation material, a set of fine picks, and the kind of small, patient hands that came from 20 years of learning to work in tight spaces without force. He seated the connector properly, which he could feel rather than see, a mechanic's knowledge that lives in the fingertips when the fingertips have been trained correctly. He added the retention clip. He verified the pin contact 3 times using a continuity tester that had probably been purchased for $15 at a hardware store. Then he closed the panel. "Someone want to button this up?" he said, standing and stepping back from the car. The young technician who had handed him the alignment pick stepped forward and refastened the panel with the specific sequence tool. The bay had the particular silence of a room full of people who are all thinking the same thing but haven't confirmed it yet. Evan picked up his toolbox. "Do you want to start it?" he said to Celeste. She looked at him for a moment. "You do it." He didn't argue. He set the toolbox back down, and the young technician opened the Bugatti's driver door, and Evan folded himself into the driver's seat with the careful, slightly self-conscious movement of a man who was acutely aware that the seat he was sitting in cost more than most cars he'd ever worked on. He found the ignition. He pressed it. The Bugatti tourbillon came back to life. Not gradually. Not after a hesitation. It simply started, the engine catching with that immediate, full-throated authority that only engines built to this specification produce. A sound that filled the bay the way music fills a room, occupying all the available space with something that was impossible to ignore. The engineers cheered. 2 of the technicians actually laughed. Not at anything, just at the release of it. Dominic stood with his arms at his sides, looking at the running car with an expression that was equal parts professional relief and something more personal that he was doing his best to keep off his face. Dr. Holt nodded slowly, twice, the way a man nods when he's internally correcting his own methodology. Celeste Whitmore stood in the middle of her service bay listening to a $5 million car run and thinking about something she hadn't thought about in a long time. What it felt like to be wrong about a thing, and to have that wrongness revealed not by something complicated, but by a question that was so simple it had gone unasked. She looked at Evan, who had stepped out of the Bugatti and was picking up his toolbox again. He was already moving toward the bay exit, the way people move when they've finished a job and have other places to be. "Mr. Calder," she said. He stopped. "Would you like to at least stay long enough to tell me how you knew?" He thought about it. "I can give you maybe 40 minutes, he said. "I have to pick up my daughter at 3:15. She nodded. "I'll have someone bring coffee." "That's fine," he said. "I take it plain." They walked upstairs. The coffee arrived in proper ceramic mugs, which Evan noticed and appreciated in the way you notice small dignities when you're not expecting them. He was sitting across from Celeste in her office again, the red toolbox on the floor beside his chair, and the Bugatti was running in the service bay 2 floors below them. He could feel more than hear it, a faint tremor in the building that came and went as Marcus's team cycled through the verification protocols. Celeste had her hands wrapped around her mug and was watching him with the particular attention of someone who has just been surprised and is trying to understand precisely how it happened. "Start from the beginning," she said. "How you knew." Evan took a sip of coffee, plain as he'd asked. "I didn't know," he said. "That's the first thing. I had a hypothesis. There's a difference." "All right, your hypothesis then." He leaned back slightly in the chair. "When your technician, the one whose wife brings the Corolla in, when he told me about the situation, the part that caught my attention wasn't that the car wouldn't start. Cars don't start for 1,000 reasons. The part that caught my attention was that it had happened right after a software update." Celeste nodded. "The engineers checked the update. The completion was confirmed." "Right. And that's exactly the problem." He paused, not for effect, just to order his thoughts. When something gets confirmed by a system, people stop looking at the physical reality of the thing. The screen says yes, so the answer is yes. But software confirmation of a hardware connection is only as reliable as the hardware connection that the software is reading through. If the connection is degraded, not broken completely, just degraded, you can get a successful software confirmation and a failed physical reality at the same time. The tab. The tab, or anything like it. I didn't know it was going to be a tab, specifically. I knew it was going to be something physical that got missed because everyone trusted the digital confirmation. He turned the mug in his hands. The thing is, the more sophisticated your diagnostic equipment, the more it predisposes you to look for sophisticated problems. Ronan Vale. And I'm not criticizing the man, he's forgotten more about these cars than I'll ever know. But Ronan Vale walks into a room and his entire professional experience is telling him this is a complex fault, because complex faults are what a car like this has. Nobody in that room was primed to look for a bent tab on a connector housing. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Nobody except you. I didn't have any other option, Evan said. I don't have the equipment to run the diagnostic sequences they ran. I couldn't have duplicated their work if I'd wanted to, so I had to think about what they might have skipped, because that was the only lane available to me. She studied him. There was something about the way he said it, the only lane available to me, that was matter-of-fact in a way that most people weren't about their own limitations. Most people either overstated their abilities or underplayed them in the particular way that was itself a form of performance. Evan Calder seemed to have a very accurate and completely undefended map of what he knew and didn't know, and he spoke from that map without editorial. "How long have you been a mechanic?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a wince, more like a small internal adjustment. "That depends on how you define it," he said. She waited. He looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the city was doing its afternoon business. A delivery truck, a woman pushing a stroller, two men in construction vests eating sandwiches on a low wall. The ordinary world. "I have a degree in automotive systems engineering," he said, in the tone of someone reciting a fact that no longer feels like it belongs to them. "I spent 6 years working in advanced development, prototype programs mostly. Some racing-adjacent work. I was part of a team that was doing early development work on integrated communication architecture for hybrid performance systems." He paused. "That was a while ago." Celeste did not say anything, because she could tell there was more and that he would get there in his own time. "My wife got sick," he said. "It started when our daughter was about 3. By the time Maya was 5, it was—" He stopped. Started again differently. "It took about 2 years from the diagnosis, and during that time I was still trying to work, still trying to maintain the career trajectory, and I was also trying to be present. And the truth is, I couldn't do both of those things at the same level. Nobody can. I made choices about where to put my attention." He turned back from the window. "After she passed, I had a 10-year-old. I'm sorry, a 5-year-old. Maya was 5. He'd said 10-year-old first. Celeste noted it and did not comment. "I had a 5-year-old daughter and a career that required the kind of total commitment that I didn't have to give anymore. And I looked at what that career was actually asking of me versus what Maya was actually asking of me, and the math wasn't complicated." "You walked away from it," Celeste said. "I redirected," he said, in a way that suggested this distinction mattered to him. "The shop lets me work on my own schedule. Pick up and drop off is non-negotiable. If Maya's school has a thing, I'm at the thing. The career I left, that wasn't going to allow for that. It wasn't built for it." Celeste thought about her own calendar. The 7 a.m. calls, the evenings that ran until 10 or 11 and felt like they'd been cut short. She had made different choices, and she didn't regret them, but she understood, sitting across from this man, that they were choices, not inevitabilities. "How old is she now?" she asked. "Maya." A small change in his face, the specific lightning that happened when someone mentioned their kid and couldn't help it. 10, he said. 4th grade. She's currently very interested in understanding how things work, which I'm choosing to interpret as an early engineering tendency, and not just the phase where kids pull things apart to see what's inside. "Could be both," Celeste said. "Probably is both," he agreed. He glanced at his watch. Not rudely, just the automatic checking of someone who has a hard stop and keeps track of it honestly. "I should probably get going in about 20 minutes, he said. "Right, of course." Celeste put down her mug and looked at him directly. "Before you do, so I want to offer you something." "You already told Marcus to prepare an invoice," Evan said. I appreciate that, but the job was 40 minutes of my time, not counting the 2 days I spent thinking about it on my own. Whatever the standard consulting rate, I'm not talking about the invoice, Celeste said. He waited. I want to offer you a position, she said. Head of Diagnostic Consulting for the Technical Services Division. You'd have a team, a proper facility, access to the factory support networks. The salary would be— No, Evan said. It came out quickly. Not rudely, just immediately. You didn't let me finish the salary number, Celeste said. The salary number doesn't change the answer. He said it without apology. I understand that sounds strange, coming from someone who runs a shop 6 blocks away and drives a 12-year-old pickup. But the position you're describing would change the structure of my life in ways that don't work. Celeste looked at him. Because of Maya. Because of Maya, he confirmed. She's 10. These are— He paused, seeming to look for the right word and not wanting to reach for something dramatic. These are the years. I don't get them twice. And the kind of role you're describing, in the kind of company you're running, would gradually but definitely eat those years. I've seen how it works. I lived in that world. The office was quiet for a moment. Through the glass wall, the service bay was visible below. Marcus's team, still working through the verification sequence on the now-running Bugatti, movement and purpose restored to a machine that had been stubbornly, expensively inert for 3 days. Celeste Whitmore was 30 years old and had not personally considered, in any serious way, the specific question of what years she might be spending versus saving. She filed that thought somewhere she'd come back to later. I respect that, she said, and meant it. Oh. She walked him down to the lobby herself, which was something she didn't typically do, and they rode the elevator in a comfortable silence that neither of them felt compelled to fill. In the lobby, Evan set down the toolbox to shake her hand, and Celeste shook it, and then she said, because something had been forming in her mind during the previous 20 minutes, and she couldn't quite let it go yet. Can I ask you something that's not really my business? He picked the toolbox back up. Sure. Do you miss it? The engineering work, the advanced programs? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at the door, then at the middle distance that exists when someone is looking at a question rather than an exit. Yeah, he said finally. Some of it, the problem-solving part, the part where you're looking at something that doesn't work and you have to figure out why, and the answer requires you to know a lot of different things at once. He shifted the toolbox to his other hand. But missing a thing doesn't mean the decision to leave it was wrong. I miss things about being 22, too. That doesn't mean I want to be 22 again. He pushed through the lobby door and walked out into the afternoon sun. Celeste watched him go through the glass. He walked the way he did everything else. Without hurry, without performance, just covering ground in the direction he needed to go. She spent the rest of the afternoon doing what she had to do, calling Gerald Forsyth to tell him the car was resolved and would be delivered on schedule, sitting with Marcus through the final sign-off verification, reviewing the incident documentation that Dominic and Petra had already begun preparing with the careful, slightly defensive thoroughness of people writing a report about a problem they didn't solve. At 6:15, when the building had mostly emptied and the Bugatti was wrapped and ready in the secure delivery bay and Marcus had gone home to his family, Celeste sat alone in her office and did something she rarely did. She looked Evan Calder up. Not through any private channels, just the ordinary internet, because he hadn't given her a reason to respect his privacy any less than anyone else's, and because she was curious in the specific way you get curious about someone who has just shown you something about the gap between how things look and how they are. What she found was less than she expected and more than she was prepared for. There were a few papers, published technical papers from about 8 years ago, co-authored, buried in industry journals with dry titles that obscured genuinely advanced thinking about integrated system communication in hybrid performance architectures. There was a brief mention in a motorsport publication, a sidebar, not even an article, noting the development team behind a prototype program that had been quietly discontinued when one of the primary engineers had stepped away from the project. There was, in a regional business database, the registration for Calder Automotive Repair, established approximately 7 years ago, listed under a Ashford Street address, sole proprietor. That was the whole record. From published papers on the forward edge of automotive engineering to a solo repair shop in 6 blocks in about as many years. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She thought about the way he'd said, "I redirected," and the care in the word, the effort not to make it sound like sacrifice, even though it obviously was, in the way all real choices are sacrifices of the alternatives. She thought about something her father had said to her once, years ago, when she was young enough to still be surprised by things he said. The people with the most options are usually the ones who think choice is free. She hadn't fully understood it then. She thought she might be getting closer now. She didn't call him the next day. She didn't call him the day after that either, because she was someone who had learned the value of thinking things through before committing to them, and because she recognized that the impulse she felt to offer Evan Calder something, to find some structure that would bring that particular quality of thinking inside her organization, was partly professional and partly something less clearly defined that she needed to examine before she acted on it. Over the next week, she quietly revisited the incident documentation. She asked Marcus to walk her through the exact protocol that had been followed during the software update installation. She asked Petra, who had, somewhat surprisingly, requested a 3-day extension of her factory visit, to review the connector inspection procedures in the standard pre-delivery protocol. "There is no connector inspection in the standard protocol," Petra told her, with the specific discomfort of someone reporting information they wish were different. "The diagnostic confirmation is the connector verification. Physically inspecting the connector housing is not a step." "Should it be?" A pause. "It should be a step now," Petra said. Celeste had that exchange documented and sent to the factory technical team, which was either bold or appropriate depending on your perspective, and which Celeste considered to be simply necessary. She also had a longer conversation with Dr. Raymond Holt, who had called her 3 days after the incident, not, he made clear, for any reason related to his billing, which was already settled, but because he had been thinking about the diagnostic process and felt he owed her something honest. "I want to tell you that I missed it," he said. "I've been doing this for 19 years, and I missed a failed alignment tab because I was working from the assumption that a physical inspection had been completed during installation. That's a methodological error. I should have verified physical conditions before accepting software confirmation." "I appreciate you saying so," Celeste said. "I'm not saying it for your benefit," Dr. Holt said, a little tartly. "I'm saying it because I need to say it to somebody, and you're the relevant party. In 19 years, I don't think I've been shown a gap in my own process by someone working with a $15 continuity tester and a flashlight." "He's got a good flashlight," Celeste said. A long pause. "Yes," Dr. Holt said. "I imagine he does." She called Evan on a Thursday, 12 days after he'd walked out of her lobby. He picked up on the third ring, slightly out of breath. "Calder Automotive." "It's Celeste Whitmore." A brief pause. "Hey." Just that. Unceremonious, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. "Am I catching you at a bad time?" "I'm under a 2008 Land Cruiser," he said. "Give me a second." She heard the sound of movement, the specific scrape of someone shifting on a concrete floor. And then the ambient noise changed, and she could hear traffic in the background instead of the shop. "Okay, what's up?" "I have a proposition," she said. "Not a job offer, a different kind of arrangement. I want to talk it through with you, but not on the phone. Can we get 45 minutes? Maybe early next week?" "I can do Monday," he said. "I have an 8 a.m. to 9:15, and then I have to get Maya to school, but I can be at your place by 10. "Or you could pick the location," she said. "It doesn't need to be here." A brief pause. "There's a diner on Clement Street," he said. "It's about halfway between us. They leave you alone and the coffee's decent." "Monday at 10, she said. "What's it called?" "Parker's," he said. "You'll see the sign. It's small." "I'll find it." Parker's Diner was exactly what he'd described, which was its best quality. 8 tables, a counter with 6 stools, a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed significantly in what appeared to be a decade, and a quality of deliberate professional indifference from the staff that Celeste, who had spent too much of her adult life in places where people recognized her and behaved accordingly, found genuinely restful. She arrived 2 minutes early and found Evan already in a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of him and a child's drawing on the table beside his mug. When she reached the booth, he picked up the drawing and folded it into his jacket pocket with the practiced, unselfconscious efficiency of a parent who carries these things everywhere. "Maya?" Celeste asked, nodding toward his pocket as she sat down. She left it on the seat of the truck this morning, he said. She does that, leaves things in places they don't belong and then complains when they get wrinkled. What was it? He considered this for a moment, then pulled the drawing back out and unfolded it, and slid it across the table. It was a drawing in colored pencil, a car, clearly, though rendered with the specific stylistic freedom of a 10-year-old who knows what she means even if the proportions aren't quite settling. And underneath it, in large, careful letters, "How does the engine know to start?" Celeste looked at it for a moment. Something about the question, the way it was phrased, the particular angle of attack, reminded her of the way Evan had stood in front of the Bugatti and asked whether anyone had physically checked the connectors. She asks good questions, Celeste said. Evan took the drawing back and refolded it. She does, he said. It's inconvenient sometimes. A waitress appeared and Celeste ordered coffee. When it arrived and the waitress had moved away, Celeste put both hands on the table and said, "Here's what I want to propose." Okay. A consulting arrangement, flexible, project-based, your terms. When my technical team encounters a diagnostic problem, they can't resolve through standard protocols. And after last week, I'm very aware that this happens more than I'd previously acknowledged. I want to be able to call you. No fixed hours. No office. No reporting structure. You review the situation, you tell me what you think, and if you engage on your terms and your timeline, with the exception that truly urgent situations, like the Bugatti, might need you in a room with a day's notice. Evan was listening. Not performing listening, actually listening, the way people do when they're processing something they might say yes to. The other component, Celeste continued, is that once a quarter, I'd like you to come in and spend a half day with my engineering team, not to lecture, to have a conversation about how they think about problems, about what they assume, about the space between what the screen says and what the actual physical reality is. He was quiet for a moment. You want me to teach your team to look at connectors? I want you to teach my team to ask whether anyone looked at the connectors, she said. That's a different thing. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the same small gesture she'd noticed in her office 2 weeks ago. A habit, something his hands did when his mind was working. Can I ask what made you land on this instead of just updating the inspection protocol? He said. Because that seems like the more direct solution. I already updated the inspection protocol, she said. I sent a recommendation to the factory team as well. But protocols get written, and then they get followed until they become automatic. And then people stop thinking about why they exist. And eventually you end up with a protocol that's supposed to prevent a problem becoming the reason the problem gets missed. She paused. I'm not trying to solve it with procedure. I'm trying to solve it by having someone in the room periodically who thinks the way you think. He looked at her. What way is that? She picked up her coffee. Like the answer might not be where everyone's already looked. Evan was quiet for a moment longer. Outside, the morning was doing its ordinary business. A bus went by. A woman walked past the diner window pulling a small wheeled cart. A pigeon made an unsuccessful attempt on something near the curb. The arrangement would need to be genuinely flexible, he said, finally. Not flexible in the way that means flexible until it's not. Actually flexible. If Maya's sick, I'm not available. If her school has a parent thing, I'm not available. Those aren't negotiations. Understood. And I want it in writing that the shop stays primary. If there's a conflict between what you need and what a regular customer of mine needs, I honor the existing commitment. That's fair. And I'm not going to pretend I know things I don't know, he said. Some of what your team works on, the current generation system stuff, I'm going to need to get up to speed on things I haven't touched in years. I'll be honest about that when it's relevant. That's also fair, Celeste said. Honestly, that's probably part of what makes you useful. You're not going to bluff your way through something because your professional reputation depends on appearing to know. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not amusement exactly, more like recognition. You've met some people like that. The automotive industry is full of people like that, she said. Present company very much accepted. He was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee, finished what was left of it, and set the mug down. All right, he said. Send me the paperwork. I'll have a look at it. I'll have the legal team put something together this week. Nothing too complicated, he said. I'm not going to read 50 pages. 10 pages at most, she said. I'll have them write it like they mean it. He almost smiled. That'd be something. The waitress came and refilled both mugs without asking, which was the diner's primary skill. Celeste wrapped her hands around the warmth of the cup and felt, for the first time since the beginning of the Bugatti situation, something that was close to, not satisfaction exactly, but resolution. The sense of a thing that had started badly working its way toward an ending that was better than the problem deserved. "Can I ask you something?" Evan said. "Sure." "Why does it matter to you, the thinking part? You could just hire someone like Raymond Holt on retainer and call it done." Celeste looked at her coffee for a moment. Because Raymond Holt, for all his credentials, walked into that bay and ran every diagnostic protocol he knew, and when the protocols didn't find it, he was stuck. And you walked in with a flashlight and a hypothesis and found it in 10 minutes. She paused. That tells me there's something about the way he was trained to look at problems that created a blind spot. And I don't want my company to have blind spots I can't see. Evan nodded slowly. Also, she said, that drawing your daughter left in your truck. How does the engine know to start? That's a better question than anything in Raymond Holt's diagnostic report, and she's 10 years old. Evan reached into his jacket pocket and pressed the folded drawing flat on the table with one hand, looking at it. She's going to figure out the engine thing on her own, he said. She's the kind of kid who doesn't let questions go. She gets that from somewhere, Celeste said. He folded the drawing back up, carefully this time, and put it back in his pocket. Outside, the bus route had cycled back. The morning was getting on. In an hour, Evan would be back under the Land Cruiser, and Celeste would be back in meetings, and the Bugatti was already at Gerald Forsyth's residence, presumably being driven to the lake house with the seamlessness that had always been promised. But something small had changed in the way one of those mornings was going to feel. Not dramatic, not resolved in any big final sense, just a little better arranged than it had been before, like a connector that had been improperly seated for a long time and had finally been pressed into place. The paperwork arrived on a Wednesday, 9 days after the meeting at Harker's. It was exactly 10 pages, as promised, written in language that said what it meant without the usual architectural excess of legal documents that seemed designed more to demonstrate their own complexity than to communicate anything clearly. Evan read it at the shop counter during lunch, so a sandwich from the place 2 doors down that Maya had declared the best in the city, which was generous given that she had limited comparative data. And he found 3 things he wanted to adjust and nothing he found unacceptable. He made the changes in pencil in the margins, photographed the pages with his phone, and emailed them to the address listed on the cover letter. The response came back within 4 hours with all 3 changes accepted, and a note from what he assumed was a junior attorney that read, in its entirety, revised agreement attached. Ms. Whitmore asked that we confirm your preferred method of payment for consulting engagements. He replied with his bank details, and a note that said he also accepted checks if that was easier for their accounting system, because he'd found over the years that giving people options reduced friction. The signed agreement came back the following Friday. He put it in the file folder he kept in the back of the shop's single filing cabinet, between the business insurance documents and the lease renewal paperwork from 3 years ago. He didn't frame it or photograph it or tell anyone about it except Marcus Okafor's wife, who came in the following Tuesday with the Corolla, and only then because she asked directly. She'd heard from Marcus that something had been worked out, and she had the particular forthright curiosity of someone who feels personally responsible for a connection she'd helped facilitate. "So you're going to be working with them?" she asked, leaning against the counter while he checked the Corolla's brake fluid, which was getting toward the low end of acceptable and would need attention before winter. "Occasionally," Evan said. "Is that good?" He considered it. "It's different," he said, "which might end up being good. I'll know more in a few months." She nodded, satisfied with this answer in the way that people who asked honest questions were satisfied with honest answers. "Marcus says the whole service team has been talking about what you found." "They found it," Evan said. "I just pointed at the right panel." "That's not what Marcus says." "Marcus is being generous." He recapped the fluid reservoir and moved to the next item on the checklist. "Tell him I said thanks, by the way, for mentioning the situation in the first place." "He'll say he was just talking," she said. "I know," Evan said. "That's why it worked." She paid for the service, tipped more than the service cost, which Evan always found slightly embarrassing but had stopped arguing about because regular customers who tipped well were the structural foundation of the shop's economics, and drove away in the Corolla, which would need those brakes before November. He went back to work. The first consulting engagement under the new arrangement came 6 weeks after the agreement was signed, and it arrived not as a dramatic crisis, but as something considerably more mundane. A McLaren 720S that was displaying an intermittent power delivery fault that the car's onboard diagnostics were flagging inconsistently, sometimes at startup and sometimes not at all, in a pattern that defied the straightforward interpretation Marcus's team had initially attempted. Marcus called him on a Thursday morning. "I know this isn't the Bugatti situation," he said, "and I know we could probably work through it eventually, but the owner is—" A pause. "The owner is a specific type of person." "Impatient," Evan said. "Specific," Marcus repeated, choosing his word carefully. "He checks in twice a day." He used the phrase unacceptable timeline in an email at 7 this morning. Evan was quiet for a moment. He had 3 cars in the shop that day, and pickup was at 3:15. "Send me the diagnostic data," he said. "The full logs, not the summary. I'll look at it tonight after Maya's in bed and call you tomorrow." The logs came through at noon. Evan looked at them briefly over lunch, then more carefully at 9 that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after Maya had finished her homework and been persuaded through the usual sequence of negotiations to actually go to sleep. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way houses got quiet when a single parent was in them alone, a quality of silence that had texture, that was made partly of absence. The fault pattern in the McLaren's logs was interesting, not in the way the Bugatti had been interesting. That had been a static physical problem wearing the costume of a software mystery. This was something more legitimately intermittent, a genuine variability in the data that suggested the fault changed with operating conditions. He built a rough picture of it on paper, not a diagram, just notes, the specific kind of shorthand he'd developed during the engineering years that looked like symbols to anyone else and read like complete sentences to him. And by 10:30, he had a hypothesis. He called Marcus the next morning at 7:15. "It's a ground path issue," he said without preamble. "The power delivery fault is real, but it's symptomatic. The underlying problem is an intermittent ground connection somewhere in the high-voltage circuit management system. When the ground is clean, the system reads normally. When it degrades, probably with heat, which is why it's inconsistent, the ECU sees a false reading and flags the fault." "A ground," Marcus said. "We checked grounds." "You checked the listed ground points," Evan said. "But this car had a retrofit battery management controller installed about 8 months ago. It's in the service history. That installation added a secondary ground path that may not be in your standard check protocol because it wasn't in the original architecture." A pause. "How do you know about the retrofit?" "It's in the detailed service history your team sent over. Page 7, 11 lines from the top." Another pause, longer. "Okay, so what are we looking for?" "A supplemental ground lug, probably mounted to the chassis near the rear battery housing. Check the torque on the connection and look at the terminal contact surface. If the retrofit was installed under any time pressure, it's possible the surface prep wasn't thorough, which would give you exactly this kind of intermittent degradation pattern." He heard Marcus writing something down. "I'll have someone look this morning." "Let me know what you find," Evan said. "Either way. If I'm wrong, the data will tell you something else and we'll go from there." He was not wrong. The call came back at 2 that afternoon. The supplemental ground lug had been installed against a section of chassis that had not been adequately prepared. Paint residue under the terminal, which over 8 months of heat cycling had gradually increased the resistance at the contact point. Marcus's technician had cleaned the surface, properly retorqued the connection, and the McLaren's fault had not reappeared in 4 hours of subsequent testing. "The owner has been notified," Marcus said. He said good and hung up. "High praise," Evan said. "For him, genuinely yes." A brief pause. "I've got to say, you got that from logs and a service history document. You never touched the car." "I had enough information," Evan said. "Most of the time you do. You just have to read all of it." He could hear Marcus processing this. "The part about the retrofit being on page 7, Marcus said. Nobody on my team had flagged that." "I know," Evan said. "That's the thing about page 7. He didn't explain what he meant by that, and Marcus didn't ask, and Evan spent the rest of the afternoon finishing a brake job on a neighbor's Subaru, and thinking, in the way he'd been thinking more often lately, about the difference between information and attention. Because page 7 of the service history had been there. Every person who'd worked on that McLaren had theoretically had access to it. But access to information and actually reading it with the kind of careful, open-minded attention that allowed you to see what mattered. Those were different skills, and the gap between them was where most diagnostic errors lived. He'd learned that the hard way, years ago, in a different context. Not with cars. He'd learned it sitting in a hospital room, reading his wife's treatment documentation, page after page of it, in the months after the diagnosis when he'd been desperate to understand what was happening and why the treatment was or wasn't working. He'd read everything, every paper he could access, every clinical note. He'd built the same kind of shorthand notes he built now for mechanical problems, trying to see the pattern, trying to find the thing the doctors hadn't found yet. He hadn't found it. There wasn't a thing to find. Some problems didn't have a connector with a broken tab. Some problems were just the problem. But the habit of reading everything, of refusing to assume that the summary told you what page 7 told you, that had stayed with him. It had migrated from the most important context he'd ever applied it in to the merely professional, and somewhere in that migration it had become instinct. He thought about this while he drove to pick up Maya, which was perhaps not the lightest thing to think about at 3:15 on a Friday afternoon, but his mind had never been good at choosing its own timing. Maya came out of school with the specific energy of a child who had been sitting still for 6 hours and found the concept increasingly unreasonable. She was small for 10, which she found annoying, and she had her mother's eyes, dark and direct, and with a quality of evaluation in them that people sometimes found unsettling until they understood it was just how she looked at everything, not just at them. She got in the truck and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something that happened today, and I need you to not immediately say it's fine, because it's not fine, but it's also not a big deal." Evan pulled away from the curb. "Okay." "There was a science thing," she said. "We were supposed to make predictions about what would happen to a plant if you changed one condition. And I made my prediction and I was right. But the way Ms. Carmichael explained why it was right was different from the reason I thought it was right." "Different how?" "She said the plant grew toward the light because it was trying to find food. But that's not exactly right. The plant doesn't try to do anything. It grows toward the light because the cells on the shaded side produce more auxin, and that makes them elongate faster, and the differential elongation bends the plant toward the light. It's not trying. It's chemistry." Evan was quiet for a moment. "Did you tell Miss Carmichael that?" I raised my hand and said I thought the explanation was maybe incomplete. "And?" "She said I was technically correct, but that the simplified version was appropriate for 4th grade. A pause. "I said that the simplified version might give people the wrong idea about how plants actually worked, and that seemed more problematic than the explanation being complicated. How did that go over?" "Not great," Maya said. "But I wasn't wrong." Evan drove for a block without speaking. The afternoon traffic was doing what it did. The school zones and the commuters beginning to accumulate. The city's particular Friday afternoon impatience starting to show at the intersections. "You weren't wrong," he said. "But there's a version of being right that's more useful than other versions, and it usually involves leaving the other person feeling okay about the conversation." "I know that," Maya said, with the tone of someone who knew it in theory and found the practical application occasionally inconvenient. "But when someone explains something wrong, it bothers me." "I know it does," he said. "That's not a bad thing. Just work on the delivery." She looked out the window. "Dad?" "Yeah." "How come you know when something's explained wrong?" He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Like, how do you know when to trust what someone tells you and when to keep looking?" He thought about this for the length of 2 traffic lights, which was his standard unit of measurement for questions that deserved a real answer. "It's not really about trusting or not trusting," he said finally. "It's more about staying curious after you've been given an answer. An answer is a stopping point, but it doesn't have to be your stopping point. If the answer feels complete to you, if it accounts for everything you can observe, then you can stop. But if there's something that doesn't quite fit, something the answer doesn't account for, then you keep going. Not because the person who gave you the answer was wrong, just because the answer wasn't finished yet." Maya was quiet. He could tell she was thinking about it rather than dismissing it, which was different from how some of his other explanations had landed over the years. "Is that what you did with the Bugatti?" she asked. He looked at her quickly, then back at the road. "You know about the Bugatti?" Mrs. Okafor told her daughter, who told Sophia in my class, who told me, she said, with the efficiency of a 10-year-old summarizing an information network. She said you fixed an expensive car that nobody else could fix. She made it sound like a big deal. It was a moderate deal, Evan said. Sophia said it cost like $10 million. Information degrades as it travels, Evan said. It was closer to 5. Maya absorbed this with the particular calm of a child for whom the difference between 5 million and 10 million was largely academic. But you fixed it? I found what was wrong with it, he said. Fixing it was straightforward once you knew what to look at. What was wrong with it? A small piece inside a connector was broken. Everyone was looking for a complicated problem because the car was complicated and expensive. Nobody looked for a small broken piece because the software said everything was fine. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then, but the software was reading through the broken piece. He glanced at her again. Yeah, he said. Exactly. So the software's answer was only as good as the thing it was reading through. That's right. She nodded, like something had been confirmed. That's like Ms. Carmichael's plant explanation, she said. The simplified version was reading through the wrong idea, so even though it got to the right answer in this case, it would give you the wrong answer in a different case. Evan didn't say anything for a moment. He pulled into the parking spot behind the shop and turned off the engine and sat there. Yeah, he said. That's exactly like that. Maya gathered her backpack from the footwell, apparently satisfied. Can I have a snack before I do homework? There's apple slices in the fridge, he said. Don't eat them all before dinner. That was one time, she said, and got out of the truck. He sat in the parked truck for another 30 seconds before following her inside. The quarterly session with Whitmore's engineering team was Celeste's idea, and it had sounded reasonable enough in the diner at Harker's. In practice, preparing for it required Evan to think more carefully than he was used to about things he normally just did, which turned out to be its own kind of work. He didn't want to lecture. He'd been clear about that, and Celeste had agreed. But the distinction between lecture and structured conversation was easier to name than to execute. He spent the better part of 3 evenings, after Maya was asleep, at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea that went cold while he was thinking, trying to figure out what he actually wanted to say to a room full of engineers who were, by and large, more credentialed than he was in the current state of the field. What he kept coming back to was this. The Bugatti problem wasn't about expertise. Everyone in that service bay had expertise. The problem was about assumptions, specifically about the assumption that was so foundational it had become invisible. The assumption that a completed digital verification meant a completed physical reality. That assumption wasn't stupid, it was in most cases correct. Diagnostic systems existed precisely because they were more reliable than human inspection in most scenarios. But most was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and the gap between most and all was exactly where the Bugatti had fallen. He wrote this down, then crossed out the word fell, and didn't replace it with anything, because the point wasn't to be elegant about it. The point was to say something true in a way that made people think rather than nod. On the 4th evening, Maya came and stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, which meant it was later than he'd thought. You're still up, she said. Go back to bed. She didn't. She came and looked at the papers on the table with the unselfconscious nosiness of a child in their own home. What are you working on? Trying to figure out how to talk to some engineers about assumptions, he said. She read the closest paper upside down, which she was inexplicably good at. You wrote the same sentence 4 times. He looked at the paper. She was right. 4 variations on the same basic idea. The problem isn't the tool, it's the faith in the tool. Each slightly differently worded, and none of them quite landing. What's wrong with it? She asked. It sounds like I'm criticizing the tools, he said. I'm not criticizing the tools. The tools are right most of the time. I'm criticizing what happens when you stop asking whether this is one of the times they're not. Maya thought about this with the brief but genuine focus she gave to things she found interesting. So you're not saying the tools are wrong, she said. You're saying that when everyone agrees the tools are right, someone still needs to check whether the question was right. He looked at her. Like, the software said the connector was fine, she said. But the question was, is the connector fine? And the software was answering a different question, which was, does the connector send enough signal to register as fine? Those are different questions. He stared at her for a long moment. Go to bed, he said. Was I right? Yes. Bed. She went, satisfied. He heard her door close and then the specific silence of a room with a sleeping child in it, which was different from the silence of an empty room in ways he'd never been able to articulate but could always feel. He picked up his pen and wrote, at the top of a clean page, "When everyone agrees on the answer, someone still needs to check the question." Then he put the pen down and sat back and looked at it and thought, she's 10 years old, and that's the clearest version of this idea I've encountered in 3 weeks of thinking about it. The session with the engineering team took place on a Thursday morning in the 4th month of the consulting arrangement. It was in the main conference room at Whitmore, a space designed to project confidence, with a long table and good chairs and a window that looked out over the service floor, where you could see the bays and the current vehicles and the daily activity of the business. There were 14 engineers and technicians in the room. Marcus was there, along with the 2 members of his team who had been most directly involved in the Bugatti situation. Dominic, the Bugatti factory engineer, had flown in specifically for this, which surprised Evan when Celeste mentioned it, and which he found both gratifying and slightly pressurizing. Petra had sent a written contribution in her absence, 3 dense pages that Evan had read carefully and found rigorous and genuinely useful. Celeste sat at the end of the table, not at the head. At the end, which was a small spatial choice that said something about how she wanted the room to feel. Evan stood at the window rather than at the whiteboard, which created a slight awkwardness as people tried to decide where to look, but which felt more natural to him than performing at a board. He did not start with the Bugatti. He started with a question. "I want to know about a time when your diagnostic equipment gave you the right answer to the wrong question," he said. "Not a time when it was broken or malfunctioning. A time when it worked perfectly and still pointed you in the wrong direction." The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the younger technicians, the same one who had handed Evan the alignment pick on the day of the Bugatti, raised his hand. His name was Derek, and he had the look of someone who wasn't sure if this was the kind of question that had a wrong answer. "Porsche came in last year," Derek said. "PDK fault code. Transmission control unit was throwing the code every cold start. We rebuilt the whole transmission control module. Code went away." "And then?" Evan said. Derek's expression shifted slightly. "Came back 8 weeks later, different code, same root cause. Turned out there was a cooling line that was partially blocked. The module was overheating in specific temperature conditions and throwing fault codes as a thermal protection response. The diagnostic equipment was reading the codes accurately. The codes were technically correct. But the question the codes were answering was what's experiencing distress, not why is it experiencing distress." Evan looked at the room. "The tool answered correctly," he said. The question was incomplete. He could feel the room settling into the conversation rather than waiting for a lecture, which was what he'd wanted. Dominic spoke from across the table. He had his arms folded in the way he'd had them in the service bay on the day of the Bugatti, the posture of a man who kept his assessment internal until he was ready to share it. "In Molsheim," he said, "we have a saying, confiance dans le système, vérification de la réalité. Trust the system, verify the reality. It is in our training documentation." A pause. "It is not always in our practice." "Because the system is right most of the time," Evan said. "Yes. And when it's right most of the time, what happens to the habit of verifying? It becomes," Dominic considered the word, "ceremonial," he said finally. "You do it because it is on the checklist, not because you believe you will find something." "And when it's ceremonial," Evan said, "what's the actual probability that you catch the 1 time in 100 where it matters?" The room was quiet, not uncomfortably. The quiet of people doing the math. Marcus was looking at the window. Not through it, at it. His expression had something in it that Evan recognized from the day in the service bay when the Bugatti had started. The specific look of a careful person updating their model of how they'd been operating. "The checklist isn't the problem," a woman named Wren said from the middle of the table. She was the senior electrical systems engineer and had the focused, precise quality of someone who had spent years building exactness into herself as a professional tool. "We can't abandon systematic protocols. That way leads to more errors, not fewer." "Agreed," Evan said. "I'm not suggesting we abandon anything. I'm suggesting we add 1 step." "What step?" Wren asked. "After you've run your protocols and gotten your confirmation," Evan said, "ask out loud, What question did we just answer? And then ask, is that the same question as whether this thing actually works? Ren looked at him for a moment. That sounds simple. It is simple, he said. It's also the step nobody took with the Bugatti for 3 days. She didn't have a response to that. Nobody did. The session ran 20 minutes longer than scheduled, which Evan hadn't intended, but which happened because the conversation had developed its own momentum. One example leading to another. People pulling in cases from their own experience. Dominic contributing 2 additional examples from Molsheim that Petra's written contribution had referenced. The whole thing evolving into something that felt less like a training session and more like a group of technically sharp people being given permission to examine the places where their technical sharpness had its limits. After the room cleared, Celeste walked with Evan to the elevator. "How do you think that went?" she asked. "Better than I expected," he said. "Worse than I hoped." She looked at him. "Explain." "It went well as a conversation," he said. "People engaged honestly. Dominic's ceremonial observation, that was valuable. He named something real." He pressed the elevator button. "But a good conversation isn't the same as a changed habit. People leave a room like that feeling like something shifted, and then they go back to the work, and the work is familiar, and familiar patterns are powerful. The question is whether anything stays. How do you make something stay?" He looked at the elevator doors. "Repetition," he said. "Not the same conversation. Different conversations about the same underlying question in different contexts over time. That's why quarterly works better than once. By the 3rd or 4th session, you stop teaching the idea and start reinforcing the habit." The elevator arrived. He stepped in. "My daughter put it better than I did," he said, as the doors began to close. She said, "When everyone agrees on the answer, someone still needs to check the question." Celeste stood in the hallway and watched the elevator doors meet. She thought about a 10-year-old girl with her mother's question in her head and her father's flashlight on the floor of the truck, growing up in a house where the most expensive problems got solved with the most ordinary tools, learning, the way children learn things that will matter later, that the answer is only as good as the question that produced it. She walked back to her office. On her desk, the afternoon's work was waiting. The city moved outside her window. The service bay below was full of motion and purpose, technicians doing the ordinary, necessary, imperfect work of keeping complicated things running. She sat down and opened the first of many things she needed to get through, and before she started, she wrote on the corner of the notepad she kept by her keyboard, not for anyone else, just to have somewhere to put it, the sentence Evan had said in the elevator. When everyone agrees on the answer, someone still needs to check the question. She looked at it for a moment, then she got to work. The sentence stayed on Celeste's notepad for 3 weeks before she moved it. Not because she forgot it was there. She saw it every morning when she sat down, every afternoon when she reached for the pad to write something else, every evening before she turned off the desk lamp and went home to an apartment that was well-designed and very quiet. She left it there deliberately, the way you leave a stone in your shoe, not because you enjoy the discomfort, but because the discomfort is reminding you of something you haven't dealt with yet. What she hadn't dealt with was a decision that had been forming in the background of everything else for the better part of 2 months, growing the way decisions grow when you're not quite ready to look at them directly, gathering weight in the peripheral vision until they become impossible to ignore. The decision was about the company's next acquisition. Whitmore Automotive Group had, for the past 18 months, been in quiet preliminary discussions with a smaller operation called Hargrove Precision Works, a 12-person specialty fabrication and restoration shop based in the eastern part of the state, the kind of place that existed outside the mainstream automotive world, doing careful, unhurried work on vehicles that required rare expertise and patience that most commercial operations couldn't afford to dedicate. Hargrove had 3 things that Celeste wanted: a relationship network in the collector vehicle space that would take her years to build independently, a facility that could support the kind of deep restoration work that some of her highest value clients were beginning to request, and a reputation built on 40 years of not cutting corners, which was the hardest thing to acquire and the easiest to lose. The problem was the price, which was more than the acquisition could justify on its financial merits alone, and the board knew it. She'd had the meeting 3 weeks ago, 6 people around a table, all of them smart, all of them looking at the same spreadsheets, all of them arriving at the same conclusion through the same methodology. The numbers didn't support it. She hadn't disagreed with the methodology. She disagreed with the question the methodology was answering. This was, she recognized, the same argument Evan had made about the Bugatti diagnostic process. And she was applying it to a business decision, which felt either like genuine intellectual integration or like the motivated reasoning of someone who wanted to make a purchase and was reaching for a framework to justify it. She wasn't entirely sure which one it was, and that uncertainty was what had kept the sentence on the notepad for 3 weeks. She erased it on a Thursday morning, not because she'd resolved the uncertainty, but because she'd decided to act despite it, which was a different thing and felt different in the body. Heavier, more committed, with less of the comfort of having thought your way to solid ground. She called a second board meeting. She brought different numbers, not better numbers in the traditional sense, but numbers that answered a different question. Not does this acquisition return value on its cost within 5 years, but what does it cost us not to have this capability when the market for collector-grade service work matures over the next decade, and what is that future capability worth today? It was the same asset. Completely different question. The meeting ran 2 hours longer than the first one. 3 of the 6 board members remained unconvinced at the end of it, but 4 voted to proceed, which was a majority, and which meant the acquisition would move forward into formal due diligence. She didn't call Evan to tell him about it. Their arrangement wasn't about her decisions. It was about her team's diagnostic process, and those were separate things. But she thought about him on the drive home that evening, thought about the kitchen table and the cold tea, and the 10-year-old who had articulated an epistemological principle more clearly than 3 weeks of board-level deliberation. When everyone agrees on the answer, someone still needs to check the question. The board had agreed on the answer. She had checked the question. Whether that would prove to be wisdom or stubbornness was something only the next decade would clarify. And she was old enough to understand that this was simply how consequential decisions worked. The Hargrove due diligence process brought a man named Thomas Hargrove into her life, and he was not what she'd expected. She'd expected the founder of a precision restoration shop to be like the cars he worked on, methodical, careful, somewhat formal. Thomas Hargrove was 71 years old and had the quality of someone who had stopped performing anything for anyone sometime around his 50th birthday and had found the experience tremendously liberating. He wore the same type of clothing every day: dark pants, a work shirt with the sleeves rolled, boots that had seen significant mileage. And he answered questions with a completeness that occasionally felt uncomfortable because most people weren't used to that level of directness. He came to the Whitmore Center for the due diligence walkthrough on a gray Tuesday in November, accompanied by his attorney and his daughter, who was also an attorney and who handled his affairs with the protective efficiency of someone who had watched her father be taken advantage of once and had made a professional identity out of ensuring it never happened again. Celeste met him in the lobby. He shook her hand and looked around the space with the evaluating gaze of someone who was performing their own due diligence simultaneously. "Nice building," he said. "Who designed it?" She told him. He nodded. "I looked up your Bugatti situation," he said without transition, "from earlier this year." Celeste took a moment to recalibrate to his conversational pace. "Oh? Word gets around in this world. Small community." He was already walking toward the service floor, apparently having decided the lobby was sufficiently assessed. Guy came in with a toolbox and fixed what the factory engineers couldn't. That's a story. "It became one," she said, following. "What did you learn from it?" She'd been asked this before, by Marcus, by the board. In a trade publication interview she'd given 2 months after the incident. She had answers for it, good answers, well-constructed, that covered the diagnostic methodology lessons, and the protocol updates and the value of unconventional perspectives. She gave Thomas Hargrove a different answer. "I learned that I was running an operation that had gotten very good at answering questions efficiently," she said, "and not good enough at checking whether we were asking the right questions. And I didn't see it until someone came in and asked the one we'd all skipped." Thomas Hargrove looked at her sidelong as they walked. "That's a better answer than I expected." "What were you expecting?" "Something about diverse perspectives and outside-the-box thinking." He said it in a way that made clear he found those phrases aggressively useless. "You gave me a real answer. I appreciate that." The walkthrough took most of the day. Thomas Hargrove asked specific, detailed questions about every aspect of the operation, not the financial performance, which his attorneys had already reviewed extensively, but the operational reality. How did she handle technician disagreements over diagnostic approaches? What happened when a vehicle was damaged during service? How did she communicate with clients when the answer was bad news? What was her tolerance for being wrong? That last question stopped her for a moment. Medium, she said. I'm working on high. He nodded like that was an acceptable answer. My tolerance for being wrong used to be very low, he said. It made me thorough. It also made me slow. And it made my people nervous, which made them less honest with me, which meant I was getting information that had been filtered through their worry about how I'd react. He paused by a vehicle in the service bay. A Ferrari in for brake service. Nothing unusual. It took me 15 years to understand that being okay with being wrong was actually a competitive advantage. If your people know you can hear bad news, you get the bad news while it's still manageable. Celeste thought about the Bugatti situation, about the 2.5 days of experts who had each, in their own way, been reluctant to say I don't know until the situation had forced it out of them. She thought about Ronan Vale, who had been willing to say it, and the professional cost that visible in his face when he did. Is that something you built deliberately? She asked. The tolerance for bad news. Deliberately and badly, Thomas said. I had to lose a client I valued to figure out that he'd been trying to tell me something was wrong for months and had been interpreting my responses as not wanting to hear it. He started walking again. The client was fine. He found someone else, and the work they needed done wasn't something I was set up for anyway. But I lost 6 months I could have spent solving the problem because I didn't know I was the obstacle. They reached the end of the bay and turned back. His daughter and the attorneys were at the far end, doing their own conversation at a professional distance that suggested they'd learned to give Thomas space during these assessments. You're evaluating me, Celeste said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Of course, he said. You're evaluating us too. That's what due diligence is. The financial documents are part of it. This is another part. He looked at her directly. I built that shop for 40 years. I'm not selling it to someone who's going to turn it into something I wouldn't recognize. The price reflects that. If your numbers don't work without certainty about what I'm selling to, we probably shouldn't proceed. I understand that, Celeste said, and I want to be clear about what I'm buying. I'm not acquiring Hargrove to absorb it into Whitmore's existing operations. I want it to remain distinct. The reputation is the asset. Homogenizing it would destroy the thing I'm paying for. Thomas was quiet for a moment. They were standing near the lobby entrance now, and the afternoon light was coming through the glass at a low November angle that made the polished concrete floor look like water. Your consulting mechanic, Thomas said. The Bugatti man. Evan Calder, Celeste said. He's still working with you? He is. Quarterly sessions with the technical team, and he's been available for specific diagnostic consultations. 3 in the past 4 months. What do your engineers think of him? Celeste considered this. Some of them think he's useful, she said. Some of them find it uncomfortable to have someone with less formal current expertise tell them something they missed. Derek, one of the younger technicians, has actually started sitting with Evan during some of the consultation calls, taking his own notes. And Ren, my senior electrical engineer, cited his framework explicitly in a diagnostic report last month. So the distribution is probably representative of how most groups respond to a useful disruption. And the uncomfortable ones are gradually becoming less uncomfortable, she said, because they've seen it work 3 times now, and smart people update. Thomas nodded slowly. Can I meet him? She looked at him. Evan? If that's not an unusual request. It's not unusual, she said. It might take a few days to arrange. He has a daughter he picks up at 3:15. Thomas Hargrove looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise, but something softer than that. Every day? Every day, she said. Non-negotiable. He was quiet for a moment. My wife picked up our kids every day, he said. I told myself I was building the business so she could. Turned out I was just working. There's a difference. He said it without self-pity, just the flat, accurate statement of a man who had looked at something clearly enough to describe it. I missed a lot of pickups. Celeste didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to add to that. Set up the meeting, Thomas said. I'd like to talk to him. Ouch. She called Evan that evening. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was probably at the kitchen table, Maya presumably in bed. I have an unusual request, she said. Okay. She explained the Hargrove situation briefly. The acquisition, the due diligence, Thomas's request to meet him. She tried to keep it to the relevant facts without editorializing about why she thought it mattered. When she finished, Evan was quiet for a moment. He wants to meet me specifically. He heard about the Bugatti situation. He said word gets around. Word gets around to 70-year-old restoration shop owners in the eastern part of the state, Evan said, not quite a question. Apparently the automotive world is small enough. Another pause. What does he want from the meeting? Just to talk, or is there something specific he's trying to assess? I think he's trying to assess whether I'm the kind of person who understands what she has, Celeste said. And he's decided that whether I understand what I have with you is a proxy for that. Evan was quiet for longer this time. She could hear the faint ambient sound of the house. A refrigerator, a clock somewhere, the small background noise of a space that was lived in and quiet. That's an odd way to do due diligence, he said. He's an odd man, she said. Effectively odd, though. His shop has been operating for 40 years on reputation alone. When? Whenever works for you. He's flexible. He's in town through the end of the month. I can do next Wednesday morning, Evan said. Early, before the shop opens. 7:30. He won't mind early? If he's been running a shop for 40 years, he's been up since 6, Evan said. 7:30 is practically sleeping in. They met at Harker's because Evan didn't see a reason to use a different location when this one had already proven functional. He arrived first, which was his standard practice. He found it difficult to walk into a space where someone was already waiting for him, some old discomfort with that particular power dynamic. And he was on his second cup of coffee when Thomas Hargrove came through the door at 7:28, which told Evan something about him before they'd exchanged a word. Thomas sat across from him and ordered coffee from the waitress with the unceremonious directness of someone accustomed to diners. He looked at Evan with the frank assessment of a man who had been reading people for 7 decades and had stopped pretending he wasn't doing it. You don't look like I expected, Thomas said. What did you expect? Evan asked. I don't know exactly. Someone more, he seemed to search for the word. Visible, he said. Someone who'd found a way to look like what they did. I fix cars, Evan said. I look like I fix cars. Thomas almost smiled. Fair enough. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. Tell me about the Bugatti. So Evan told him in the same matter-of-fact way he'd told Celeste. The logic of the hypothesis, the access panel, the broken tab, the 5 minutes. He didn't dress it up or inflate it. He described it the way it had been, a straightforward physical problem that had been obscured by the collective assumption that a straightforward physical problem couldn't be what it was. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Evan finished, he was quiet for a moment. When I was about 35, Thomas said, I had a Jaguar XKE come into the shop. 67, Series 1, one of the good ones. Client was a collector, very serious, very careful. Car had a misfire that 3 previous shops hadn't been able to diagnose. I spent a day and a half on it. Evan waited. Turned out one of the previous shops had replaced a plug wire, and when they routed it, they'd laid it across a heat source. Intermittent breakdown of the wire insulation when the engine reached operating temperature. Completely invisible at startup, completely obvious once you knew where to look and why. Thomas paused. The 3 shops before me had been looking at the fuel system, the ignition timing, everything except the physical routing of a wire that someone else had touched. Same principle, Evan said. Same principle, Thomas agreed. The assumption that the previous work was correct. Nobody wanted to question it directly because questioning it meant implying the other shop had made an error, and in a small community, that's a social complication. He drank his coffee. I was willing to look at it because I didn't know the previous shops and had no social investment in their competence. Sometimes the outside perspective is useful precisely because it doesn't have anything to lose, Evan said. Yes. Thomas looked at him. Do you know why I wanted to meet you? Celeste had a theory, Evan said. She thought you were using me as a proxy to evaluate whether she understands what she has. Thomas nodded. That's partially right. He set down his mug. The full version is that I've been in this business for 40 years, and I've watched a lot of acquisition conversations, and the thing that always goes wrong, always, without exception, is when the acquiring party doesn't know what they're actually buying, not the financial asset, the human one. He leaned forward slightly. Celeste has good instincts. She built something real. But she's 30 years old and she's been successful enough fast enough that she hasn't had many occasions to discover the limits of her framework. The Bugatti situation gave her one. What she did with it, bringing you in, structuring it the way she did, that told me more about her judgment than 3 years of financial statements. Evan considered this. And you wanted to verify it. I wanted to sit across from the person she brought in and see if the decision held up in 3 dimensions, Thomas said. A good decision looks good in retrospect, sometimes, but it also produces something real, an actual person, an actual relationship, an actual outcome that exists independently of the original decision. I wanted to see the outcome. The diner was filling up around them, the morning crowd arriving in the particular low-urgency rhythm of a neighborhood place on a weekday. The waitress came and refilled both cups without asking, and neither of them acknowledged it except by not moving their mugs, which was the correct social response in that context. "What do you think?" Evan said. "Since you're clearly going to think it regardless." Thomas looked at him for a moment with something that was close to amusement. "I think Celeste made a decision that most people in her position wouldn't have made," he said. "Most people would have offered you a full-time role with a number attached and been confused when you said no. She structured something that actually worked for your life, that requires a specific kind of listening." He paused. "And I think you're the kind of person who does a thing well without needing anyone to know you're doing it, which is rarer than it sounds." Evan didn't say anything to that. He looked out the window at the street, where the morning was getting on in the way mornings did, people and their purposes moving through it, the whole ordinary machinery of a day getting into gear. "My daughter drew a picture of an engine last month," he said, not sure why he was saying it except that it seemed relevant to something. "How old?" 10. "What was the picture like?" "Not accurate," Evan said. "But the question underneath it was good. She wanted to know how the engine knew to start." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "How did you explain it?" "I started to explain the ignition sequence and she said, 'I know the sequence. I mean, who told it that the sequence was how you start?' And then we were in a different conversation than I'd expected." Thomas looked at him. "What kind of conversation?" "About how systems develop language for themselves. About the difference between following a protocol and understanding why the protocol exists." Evan turned back from the window. "She's 10. She shouldn't be having that conversation yet." "Kids who ask that kind of question generally don't wait for the right age," Thomas said. "No," Evan agreed. "They don't." Thomas sat back in his chair, and something in his posture changed. The slight relaxation of a man who has gotten what he came for and can now simply be in the conversation rather than conducting it. "I'm going to complete the acquisition," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's not my decision," Evan said. "I know. I'm telling you because you're tangentially the reason I'm comfortable with it, and because I thought you should know that a conversation about a 10-year-old's drawing of an engine was apparently the deciding factor in a significant business transaction." He said it with a dry precision that was its own form of humor, which is not a sentence I expected to say this week. Evan looked at him. She'd find that satisfying. "She sounds like she would." Thomas reached for the check which had appeared on the table. "Let me get this." "You don't have to." "I know." He put down cash, exact change plus a tip that was slightly more than the standard percentage, but not ostentatiously so. The tip of a man who had worked in service before and remembered what it felt like. But the conversation was worth more than the coffee, and someone should acknowledge that. The acquisition closed 6 weeks later, in the second week of January, in a lawyer's office with the specific sterile comfort of a space designed for the signing of important documents. Thomas Hargrove signed with a pen that had a slight wobble in its clip, which Celeste noticed because she noticed things like that. The small evidence of a life lived in a particular way. The pen that had been carried long enough to develop a personality. His daughter watched from across the table with the professional calm of someone who had done their job and was now witnessing the human part of it. Celeste signed and passed the documents to her own attorney, and when it was done, Thomas Hargrove put his pen back in his shirt pocket and said, "You're going to make mistakes with this." It wasn't a criticism, just a statement. "Probably," she said. "When you do, and the first one might be sooner than you'd like, call me before you try to fix it, not instead of fixing it, before." He stood, which everyone else in the room then did as well, in the small social cascade of a formal meeting ending. Some mistakes are only fixable if you haven't already tried 3 things that made them worse. Is that from experience? From significant experience, he said. Specific and expensive experience. She walked him to the elevator, the same gesture she'd made for Evan, months earlier, for the same instinctive reason. In the elevator lobby, while his daughter and the attorneys gathered their documents, Thomas looked at her with the directness that she'd come to recognize as simply how he operated. "Take care of your mechanic," he said. "People like that are easy to take for granted once they're inside your system. He'll do the work because he's that kind of person. Make sure he knows it is valued." "I do," she said. "Good." The elevator arrived. People who don't need the recognition are often the ones who leave when they don't get it. Not for the recognition itself. Just because the absence of it tells them something about the environment. He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Celeste stood in the lobby and thought about that for a moment. Then she took out her phone and sent Evan a text message. It said, "Acquisition closed today. Thought you should know given the conversation at Harker's played a role. Thanks for the coffee." His response came back 40 minutes later, which meant he'd been under something or with a customer. "Glad it worked out. Tell Thomas I said congratulations." His XKE story was good. She smiled at her phone, which was something she didn't do often in professional contexts. She put the phone away and went back to work. February came in cold and gray, the kind of cold that settled into the city without drama and simply stayed. Evan's shop was busier in winter. Cold weather found every weakness in an older vehicle, and most of his regular clients drove older vehicles, which meant January and February ran at a pace that didn't leave a lot of room for anything else. He did 2 consulting calls for Whitmore that month, both of them remote, both of them resolved through the same process. Read the complete service history, identify what the diagnostic equipment had confirmed versus what it had physically verified, look for the gap. Both times the gap was there. Different shapes, different locations in the system, but the same underlying principle. The assumption that confirmation and verification were the same thing, carried forward by habit into a situation where they weren't. He added both cases to the notes he kept in a legal pad in the shop's back room, not for any formal purpose, but because he'd learned early in the engineering years that patterns only become visible when you record the instances. 2 cases in 4 months was not a pattern. 6 cases in 8 months would be worth paying attention to. He was tracking. Maya had started asking to come to the shop on Saturday mornings, which he allowed on the condition that she brought something to occupy herself when he needed to focus. She was not good at bringing something to occupy herself. She was good at watching him work and asking questions at critical moments, which was distracting in a way he found difficult to fully resent because the questions were usually good ones. On the second Saturday in February, she was sitting on the shop's single extra stool, a tall, metal stool that she'd claimed immediately and possessively on her first visit, the way children claim territory, watching him work through an intermittent idle problem on a client's older Volvo, and she said without preamble, "Is there a thing wrong with this car that nobody else found?" He didn't look up from the air intake assembly he was examining. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you've been looking at it for 20 minutes, and you have the face you make when you think you're close to something." He did have that face. He was aware of it. "It's possible," he said. "What is it?" "I don't know yet. That's why I'm still looking." She was quiet for a moment, which with Maya typically meant she was building toward something. "Dad." "Yeah." "Do you ever worry that you'll look at something and not find it? Like, not just this time, but generally, that there'll be a problem you can't solve?" He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. She was sitting with her feet hooked on the stool's footrest, her notebook open on her knee. She'd brought it and hadn't used it, which was standard. And she was looking at him with that direct evaluative quality that still occasionally caught him off guard, even though he'd been looking at it for 10 years. "Yes," he said. "That happens." "And then what?" "And then I say so," he said. "And I keep looking anyway in case I find something. And if I don't, I say, I couldn't find it, and we figure out the next step." "Does that feel bad?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer her questions. "Sometimes," he said, "the feeling bad part isn't about the problem, though. It's about wanting to have done enough." He paused. There's a difference between not finding a thing because it's not findable and not finding a thing because you stopped too soon. The first one is fine. The second one is what actually bothers me. Maya wrote something in her notebook. He glanced at it without making it obvious he was looking, which was a skill he'd developed gradually and which she probably saw through anyway. She'd written, "The problem isn't failing. It's not knowing whether you tried enough." He turned back to the Volvo. 10 minutes later, he found the idle problem. A hairline crack in the intake boot, invisible under normal inspection but detectable when he applied light pressure to the assembly and the idle changed in response. 3 minutes to replace, 4 minutes to verify. Done. "Found it," he said. Maya looked up from her notebook. "What was it?" He explained. She listened with the complete attention she gave to things she actually wanted to understand, then nodded once, the way she did when something fit into a framework she was building in her head. "So it was there the whole time," she said. "It was always there," he said. "I just hadn't found the right pressure point yet." She wrote something else in the notebook, and this time he didn't try to read it. Some things were hers to keep. He cleaned up the work area, returned the Volvo's key to the hook by the counter, and looked at the shop. The ordinary, imperfect, sufficient space he'd built his life around for the past 7 years. The worn counter. The filing cabinet with its practical documents. The red toolbox his father had handed him 20 years ago, battered now in a few more places than it had been then. Still functional, still doing what it was made to do. Maya hopped off the stool and zipped up her jacket. "Can we get lunch?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "What do you want?" "The sandwich place." "You always want the sandwich place." "Because it's always good," she said, with the logic of someone who found loyalty to quality self-evident. "Why would I want something different when that's working?" He turned off the shop lights and held the door for her, and she ducked under his arm the way she had since she was small enough that it required no ducking. Pure habit now. The physical shorthand of a relationship that had been building itself quietly and continuously for 10 years. Outside, the February air was cold enough to see your breath, and the street was doing its Saturday morning business. A dog walker. A woman carrying groceries. 2 teenagers on bikes moving through the intersection with the particular confidence of people who had not yet learned to be cautious. Evan locked the shop door and put the keys in his jacket pocket, next to his phone, next to the folded drawing Maya had left in the truck 3 months ago. The one he'd never thrown away, the one with the car and the question underneath it, wrinkled now along the fold lines, soft from being carried. They walked down Ashford Street in the direction of the sandwich place, their breath making small temporary clouds in the cold air, and the city moved around them the way it always did, indifferent and full of its own purposes, leaving room for theirs. March arrived the way it usually did in that city, not decisively, but by degrees, the cold loosening its grip a little more each week without fully committing to letting go. The mornings were still sharp enough to see your breath, but by early afternoon the sun had enough weight to it that you could feel it through a jacket, and that small warmth had the specific effect of making people slightly more patient with each other, the way seasonal shifts sometimes do. Evan noticed the change the way he noticed most things, without ceremony, just registering it as a fact about the current conditions. The shop had stayed busy through the winter and was still busy now, the spring rush beginning its early buildup, as people brought in vehicles that had accumulated cold weather wear and needed attention before the better driving months. He had a wait list for the first time in 2 years, which was either a sign of success or a sign that he needed to think about capacity, and he was holding that question at arm's length for the moment because the answer involved decisions he wasn't ready to make yet. The consulting work with Whitmore had settled into a rhythm that functioned the way good working arrangements function, reliably, without drama, each party understanding what they were getting and what they were offering. He'd done 7 remote consultations since the agreement was signed, 2 in-person visits to the service floor, and the second quarterly session with the engineering team, which had gone differently than the first. Not better or worse, exactly, just differently. The first session had been about introducing an idea. The second had been about what happened after people had been living with the idea for 3 months, which was more interesting because it was messier. Derek had raised a case from his own work. A Lamborghini with a persistent vibration fault that he'd resolved using the framework Evan had described, checking what question the diagnostic confirmation had actually answered before accepting it as final. He'd presented it carefully, almost formally, the way young technicians present things when they're still figuring out whether their professional authority is real. Evan had asked him 3 follow-up questions, not to test him, but because the case was genuinely interesting and the questions were the ones he actually wanted answered. And Derek had answered all three with the specific confidence of someone who had done the work and knew the details. Wren had cited Derek's case in her own contribution to the session, which was a small thing but not an insignificant one, the kind of internal acknowledgement that signaled a shift in how a team's knowledge moved through itself. Dominic had attended again, by video conference this time, from Molsheim. He'd told Evan, in his precise, slightly accented English, that he'd incorporated a physical verification step into the factory's pre-delivery update protocol, not as a checklist item, but as a required confirmation before digital sign-off. The checklist item becomes ceremonial, he'd said, which was the same word he'd used in the first session. The required confirmation before sign-off changes the accountability structure. Now someone must physically attest, not just the system. It was, Evan thought, a better solution than he'd suggested. He'd said so, and Dominic had received it with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for the acknowledgement without requesting it, which was a quality Evan respected. These were small things, individually. But small things, consistently applied over time, were how systems actually changed. Not through dramatic overhauls or singular moments of insight, but through the gradual accumulation of better habits, each one slightly less likely to produce the kind of failure that had stopped a $5 million car cold for 3 days. He understood this. He'd understood it for a long time. It was the same principle that applied to raising a 10-year-old, or to running a repair shop, or to any project that didn't have a finish line so much as a direction. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of March, while Evan was elbow-deep in the suspension assembly of a client's older Range Rover, and Maya was at school, and the shop was doing its regular business of being exactly what it was. The number was one he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail, finished what he was doing, cleaned his hands on a shop rag, and listened. The voicemail was from a man named Karl Ostrowski, who identified himself as the technical director for a racing development program that Evan had, several years ago, been peripherally connected to during his engineering tenure. The program had changed hands twice since then, and was apparently now operating under a different structure. But Karl Ostrowski's voice was familiar in the way voices are familiar when you've sat in enough meetings with someone. The particular cadence of a man who organized his thoughts before he spoke and expected others to do the same. The message was brief. There was a problem with a prototype system they were developing. The in-house team had been working on it for 6 weeks without resolution, and someone in Evan's professional network had mentioned his name. Karl was calling to ask if Evan would be willing to look at the technical documentation and offer an opinion. He left a number and said there was no obligation. Evan stood in the shop with his phone in his clean hand and the familiar, complicated feeling that this kind of call always produced. Something between interest and resistance, the two responses arriving simultaneously and not resolving into each other neatly. The interest was straightforward, the problem-solving part, the part of his brain that had been trained on exactly this kind of work and still moved toward it with the automatic lean of a plant toward light. The resistance was also straightforward, but took slightly longer to articulate, even to himself. It wasn't about time or capacity, it was about something more structural. The awareness that accepting this kind of engagement was different in degree from the Whitmore consulting work, different in the particular way that a step is different from a mile when they're both moving in the same direction. The Whitmore arrangement had been carefully bounded. He had boundaries around it. This call was from a world that had no particular interest in his boundaries. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to the Range Rover. He thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, while he worked, the way he thought about most things that mattered. Not with focused, deliberate attention, but alongside the work, letting it sit in parallel until it clarified. By the time he locked up the shop at 5:40 and drove to pick up Maya from the after-school program she attended on Thursdays, he'd decided to return the call and be honest about his conditions, not refuse. He wasn't going to refuse on principle when the work was legitimate and the problem was real, but be clear about what he would and wouldn't do, and let Karl Ostrowski decide if that worked for him. Maya was in the after-school room when he arrived, sitting at a table with 2 other kids, all 3 of them involved in something with colored pencils that appeared to be either a collaborative drawing or a territorial dispute. It was hard to tell. She gathered her things with the slightly distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was still in the previous activity, said something to the other 2 kids that made them laugh, and came to the door. In the truck, before he started the engine, she said, "You have something going on." He looked at her. "What?" "You have the face," she said. "Not the close to finding something face. The other one. The one where you're thinking about whether to do a thing." He started the engine. "Someone called about a job," he said. "A bigger job than I usually take." "Bigger how?" "More technical, more—" He paused. "More adjacent to the kind of work I used to do, before the shop." She was quiet for a moment. The truck moved through the late afternoon traffic, the city doing its end-of-day migration. "Are you going to do it?" "I'm thinking about it." "What's making you think instead of just deciding?" He considered how to answer this honestly, without making it about things that were too heavy for a Thursday evening truck conversation. "I left that world for reasons," he said. "I want to make sure taking a step back toward it is actually a step, and not a slide." She looked out this passenger window. He could see her reflection in the glass, the expression of someone processing something carefully. "Is there a difference between a step and a slide?" "A step you choose," he said. "A slide happens because you stopped paying attention to the slope." She was quiet again, which usually meant she was deciding whether a thing was worth arguing about or whether she agreed with it. "But you're paying attention now," she said. "So if you decide to do it, that's a step." He glanced at her. "That's a reasonable point." "I know," she said, with the particular lack of modesty of a child who was used to her reasonable points being acknowledged, and had stopped pretending to be surprised by it. He called Karl Ostrowski the following morning. The conversation was 40 minutes long and specific in the way of two people who shared enough technical vocabulary to have a real conversation without the usual scaffolding. Karl Ostrowski laid out the problem directly. A prototype integrated drive management system for a hybrid performance application. 6 weeks of in-house diagnostic work. A fault pattern that defied consistent categorization. The system behaved differently under different test conditions in ways that the team's current framework couldn't account for. Evan asked 4 questions. Karl answered all 4 with the completeness that confirmed he actually knew his material, which mattered. There was a category of call like this where the person asking had already framed the problem incorrectly, and no amount of looking at their documentation would help because the documentation reflected the wrong frame. This didn't feel like that. "I can review the technical documentation," Evan said. "I'll give you an honest assessment of whether I can contribute anything useful. If I can't see a path that your team hasn't already covered, I'll tell you that directly and we can stop there." "What are your terms for the review?" Karl asked. "My shop stays primary. I have a pickup at 3:15 every day. That's not adjustable. If the engagement requires on-site time, we'd need to schedule it in a way that works around that. And I mean actually works, not theoretically works. I've had enough experience with arrangements that were supposedly flexible and weren't." A brief pause. "The Whitmore arrangement has that structure?" "It does," Evan said. Celeste Whitmore understood what she was getting when she set it up. "If you want the same thing, I'm willing to have that conversation." "Fair enough," Karl said. "Send me your standard consulting terms and I'll review them." "I'll have them to you today." He sent the Whitmore agreement to his own email, made the relevant modifications. Different scope, different parties, same fundamental protections, and sent it to Karl Ostrowski's address by noon. The response came back by 3 o'clock with 2 small questions and nothing he found unreasonable. He answered the questions, signed the amended version, and added the document to the file folder in the shop's filing cabinet, behind the Whitmore agreement, in front of the lease renewal paperwork. He told Maya about it over dinner. "You're doing it," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm looking at the problem," he said. "That's all it is for now." "But you're doing it." He put down his fork. "Yeah," he said. "I'm doing it." She nodded, the way she did when something fit. "Good," she said, and went back to her dinner, and that was the whole conversation. The technical documentation for Karl Ostrowski's prototype system arrived as a set of files that, when printed, would have been approximately 200 pages. Evan didn't print them. He worked through them on his laptop in the evenings over the course of 10 days. After the shop closed, after Maya was fed and homework was finished, and the negotiation over bedtime had been completed and she was actually in bed. The kitchen table, the tea that went cold, the particular silence of the house. He took notes in his legal pad shorthand. He built a picture of the system, not as the documentation presented it, but as the fault data implied it behaved, which were two different things in ways that became increasingly interesting the more he read. By the fifth evening, he had a hypothesis. By the eighth, he had tested the hypothesis against every piece of data in the documentation and found 3 places where it held and 1 where it didn't quite fit, which was more rigorous than most hypotheses survived. By the 10th evening, he called Carl. "The fault pattern is real and it's consistent," he said. "Your team's diagnostic process has been treating it as a software layer issue because the fault presents in the software telemetry. But the telemetry is a symptom, not the source." He paused. "The source is in the thermal management of the power distribution architecture. Under specific load conditions, the heat gradient across the junction between the primary and secondary distribution systems creates a transient resistance change that the system's calibration isn't accounting for. The software sees an anomaly and responds to it, but by the time it responds, the thermal condition that caused it has already passed. So the response looks like an overreaction to nothing, which is why it's inconsistent." Carl was quiet for a moment. "How do you fix it?" "2 options," Evan said. "Short term, recalibrate the system's thermal response threshold so it doesn't react to transient conditions below a certain magnitude. That stops the fault presentation, but it doesn't address the underlying thermal dynamic. Long term, revise the junction design to reduce the heat gradient, which requires hardware modification, but makes the problem not exist instead of just not appear." "Which would you do?" "The long-term solution," Evan said. "The short-term fix is faster, but you're in prototype development. If you calibrate around a thermal problem now, and the hardware goes into production with that thermal problem still in it, you'll find it again later in a context where it's much more expensive to address." A longer pause. "Can you work with the team on the hardware revision?" Evan had thought about this moment for a few of the evenings. Not with dread, but with the clarity of someone who knows a decision is coming and wants to meet it, having already considered it rather than reacting. "I can advise," he said. "I can review their approach and give feedback. I can probably come in once, maybe twice, for on-site review at a time we schedule in advance, and that works for my other obligations." He paused. "I'm not available as an embedded team member. That's not what I am anymore." "Understood," Carl said. "The advisory role is what we need. The team has the hands. They need someone who can look at what they're building and tell them when they're solving the right problem." "That I can do," Evan said. He told Celeste about the Ostrowski engagement at the beginning of April, at their quarterly check-in, which had migrated from formal meetings to a standing coffee at Harker's on the first Monday of each new quarter, because that was where everything useful seemed to happen. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd come to appreciate about her. She didn't pre-process what you were saying into her response before you'd finished saying it. "How does it feel?" she asked when he was done. It was a question he hadn't expected. Not how does it work logistically or will it affect your availability, both of which were legitimate and which she'd ask in a moment, but that one first. "Complicated," he said. "Complicated good or complicated concerning?" He thought about it. "Complicated honest," he said. "I like the problem. I'm good at this type of problem, probably better than most people currently in the field, because the work I did before the shop gave me a framework that not many people have, and the years in the shop gave me a habit of looking at physical reality that people who stayed in the technical track don't always develop." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "But that's also the thing that makes it complicated, because knowing you're good at something can make it harder to keep appropriate distance from it." Celeste looked at him across the table. "You're worried about the slope," she said. He glanced at her. "I said that to Maya." "I know, she told me." He stared at her. "When did you talk to Maya?" Celeste had, in the past 2 months, developed a habit of texting Maya occasional questions. Not frequently, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in the easy, natural way of an adult who found a child's perspective on specific questions more reliable than most of the adult perspectives available to her. Maya had reciprocated with the slightly surprised delight of a 10-year-old who was being taken seriously by someone who didn't have to take her seriously. Evan was aware of this arrangement. He had not been aware that it had expanded to include conversations about him. "She texted me about the truck conversation," Celeste said. "She said you'd describe the difference between a step and a slide. She wanted to know if I thought you were paying attention to the slope." And what did you tell her? I told her you were probably the person in my professional experience who was most reliably paying attention to things, Celeste said, and that if you said you were paying attention to the slope, I believed you. He was quiet for a moment. The diner was doing its Monday morning business around them. The regulars, the couple who always sat at the counter, the waitress who had long since given up asking whether they wanted refills and simply brought them. She's 10, he said. She shouldn't be managing my professional anxieties. She's not managing them, Celeste said. She's thinking about them. There's a difference. And she thinks about them because she pays attention to you, which is what people do when they care about someone. He didn't have a response to that wasn't more honest than he wanted to be at 10 in the morning, so he let it pass. The engagement is within the boundaries, he said, moving back to the practical question. It won't affect my availability to Whitmore. I know, she said. I wasn't worried about that. Then what were you going to ask? She looked at him. I was going to ask if you were okay, she said. Not operationally, just okay. He looked at his coffee. Outside the diner window, a woman was walking a dog that was approximately the size of a small sofa and appeared to be enjoying the April morning with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of an animal that didn't have a complicated relationship with its own professional history. Yeah, he said. I'm okay. Good, she said, and picked up her coffee, and they moved on to the operational questions, which were simpler and took less out of both of them. The on-site visit to Karl Ostrowski's facility happened on a Thursday at the end of April. Evan had arranged it carefully, drop Maya at school, drive the 2 hours to the facility, spend 4 hours with the engineering team reviewing their hardware revision approach, drive back, pick Maya up from after school at 5:15. It was tight but workable, and he'd built an hour of buffer into the return drive for the kind of traffic that happened when you didn't leave buffer. The facility was not what he'd expected and also exactly what he'd expected. A working engineering space, which meant it looked nothing like the Whitmore Center's polished surfaces and everything like a place where actual development work happened. Whiteboards with weeks of accumulated notation. Prototype components on workbenches next to coffee cups and takeout containers. The organized chaos of a team that was deep in something. Karl Ostrowski met him at the entrance. He was in his early 50s, with the particular physical quality of someone who had spent 30 years at workbenches before spending the last decade at management tables and still wasn't entirely comfortable with the transition. He shook Evan's hand with the grip of someone who still used their hands. The team's ready, Karl said. I told them about your analysis. Some of them have questions. Good, Evan said. Questions mean they've been thinking about it. The team's 7 people. 4 of them Evan's age or younger, 3 of them older. They had the look of people who had received information they found both useful and slightly irritating. The specific expression of engineers who have been shown a thing they should have seen themselves. Evan recognized it because he'd worn it. He didn't start by presenting his analysis. He started by asking what they'd already tried and why, and what had led them to each approach. He let them tell the story of 6 weeks of work without interrupting except to ask follow-up questions. And by the end of that hour, he had a clearer picture of their thinking than he could have gotten from any documentation, because documentation recorded what happened and conversation revealed why. What emerged was not that they'd been careless or incapable. They'd been thorough. The issue was that their diagnostic framework was optimized for software layer faults, because that was what the system's own diagnostic architecture was built to detect. And the fault they were chasing was in the physical thermal reality that the software was only imperfectly measuring. They'd been answering the question the system knew how to ask, not the question the fault was actually posing. This is a hardware problem wearing a software costume, Evan said, and you've been treating it accordingly, as software, which is reasonable because that's where it shows up. But software presentation of a hardware fault means you can fix the presentation without addressing the cause. One of the younger engineers, a woman named Priya, who had been taking notes with an intensity that suggested she intended to use them, looked up from her notebook. How did you identify it as thermal rather than electrical? The inconsistency pattern, Evan said. If it were a pure electrical fault, the pattern would be more random or more consistent. The specific conditions under which the fault appeared and disappeared, load level, duration, ambient temperature, those correlate too cleanly with thermal cycling. Electrical faults don't care about ambient temperature the same way thermal dynamics do. Priya wrote something. We looked at the correlation data, she said. We didn't weight the ambient temperature variable heavily because the system's thermal management is supposed to compensate for ambient variation. The thermal management compensates for ambient variation in steady state, Evan said. But the fault is transient. It happens during the transition between load states, not in steady state. Your thermal management is calibrated for steady state operation. During the transition, there's a window where the heat gradient at the junction exceeds the management system's response capacity. A silence settled over the room, not uncomfortable. The silence of people integrating new information and checking it against what they know. That's a design limitation, Carl said from the back of the room where he'd been listening. It's a prototype limitation, Evan said. That's why you build prototypes, to find things like this before they're in production hardware. One of the older engineers, a man with gray at his temples who hadn't spoken yet, said, "The junction redesign, what would you prioritize?" Evan pulled the sketch he'd made at his kitchen table out of his jacket pocket. It wasn't a formal drawing. It was a sketch, with annotations in his shorthand, the kind of thing that looked like nothing to anyone else and read like a document to him. He put it on the table and the engineers gathered around it. For the next 90 minutes, they worked. Not Evan presenting and the team receiving, but all of them at the whiteboard and the workbench, pulling the problem apart and looking at the pieces. Evan knew things they didn't. The specific intuition built from the engineering years and refined by the shop years. And they knew things he didn't, because they'd been living inside this prototype for 6 weeks, and the familiarity was its own kind of knowledge. The conversation was better for both sets. Priya, at one point, suggested a modification to Evan's proposed junction redesign that was cleaner than what he'd sketched. A smaller change that achieved the same thermal result with less structural impact on the surrounding architecture. He looked at it for a moment. "That's better than mine," he said. She looked up. "Really?" "Yes," he said. "Use that." She wrote it down with the slightly stunned expression of someone who had offered something tentatively and been taken completely seriously, which was an experience that clearly hadn't happened to her as often as it should have. He drove back to the city with 2 hours to spare before pickup, which meant the buffer had done its job. The drive was quiet. Just the road and the late April afternoon and the specific decompression of leaving a space where you'd been concentrating hard for a sustained period. His mind was still partly in the problem, running through the session, checking the proposed solutions against what he knew, and partly already at the school, already in the truck with Maya, already home. The two parts of his life. Not in conflict, never quite in conflict, though sometimes in competition for the same hours. Just present simultaneously, the way things are when you've built something that actually fits the person you are rather than the person you were trying to become. He picked Maya up at 5:17, 2 minutes later than planned, because the last 10 miles of the return drive had disagreed with his estimate. She was waiting outside the after-school building with her backpack and her notebook, and the patient but pointed expression of a child who had noticed the 2-minute delay and filed it without comment. "How was it?" she asked, once they were in the truck. "Good," he said. "Useful." "Did you find the thing?" "I found the direction of the thing," he said. "The team is going to find the specific thing. I gave them the right map. They know the territory better than I do." She considered this. "So you both needed each other?" "Yeah," he said. "That's how it usually works when it's working right." She opened her notebook on her knee, not to write, just the habit of having it open, and looked out the window. The city was in its early evening mode, the light going golden and long the way it did in April when the days were stretching back out, and you started to remember what summer felt like. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Are you glad you went back?" He thought about it for the length of the long block they were moving through. "I didn't go back," he said. "I went forward, from a different position than I had before. It's different." "Different better?" "Different more complete," he said. "I knew things when I was doing the engineering work full-time that I don't know now. But I know things now that I didn't know then. Both sets of things were in that room today. That's why it worked." She wrote something in her notebook, which he didn't try to read this time. Some things were hers to keep. They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet of two people who had said what needed to be said and didn't feel the need to fill the space that came after. He pulled into the parking spot behind the shop, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. The shop was dark. The street was doing its early evening business, a couple walking a dog, the smell of something cooking from the apartment above, the ordinary world doing what it did. The red toolbox was on the floor of the truck bed, as it always was at the end of a day when he'd needed it. His father's name on a piece of masking tape on the inside of the lid in faded marker, handwriting he'd known his whole life. "What do you want for dinner?" he asked. Maya had already gotten out of the truck. She was standing on the sidewalk with her backpack, looking up at the sky. The way she did sometimes, for no particular reason, just looking at it. "I don't know," she said. "Something warm." "I can do warm," he said. She came back to the truck and stood next to him, and for a moment they both stood there on the sidewalk in the April evening with nothing needing to happen immediately, and he put his hand briefly on her shoulder and she leaned slightly into it, the way she'd been doing since she was small enough to do it without thought, and the city went on around them. Later that evening, after dinner and homework and the standard bedtime negotiation, which Maya won on the question of 15 more minutes, but lost on the question of using that 15 minutes to ask him about thermodynamics, because he put his foot down on that one. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that was actually still warm for once. He opened his legal pad to a new page. Not to write anything specific, just the habit of the open page, the readiness. He thought about Priya's better solution, about Thomas Hargrove's pen with the wobble in its clip, about Dominic's word, ceremonial, and how it had named something real that nobody in that first session had been able to name. About Celeste asking him, at a diner table, if he was okay, and meaning it. He thought about a broken alignment tab in a connector housing, and how the entire architecture of the past year had balanced on that small plastic failure. How the Bugatti that wouldn't start had, by some improbable chain of consequences, produced a consulting arrangement and a Hargrove acquisition and a session with Carl Ostrowski's team, where a young engineer named Priya had found a better solution than his own and been surprised when he said so. He thought about his father's toolbox and his father's handwriting on the masking tape and the particular way his father had of handing a tool to him when he was small, not placing it exactly but presenting it, with a kind of intention, as if the handing over was part of the education and not just the delivery. He tried to carry that forward. Whether he'd managed it was something he didn't know and couldn't fully judge. Because you couldn't be inside a thing and outside it simultaneously. You just did the work and paid attention and hoped the attention was enough. He heard Maya's door open, because 15 minutes always became 20, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas with the notebook in her hand and the expression of someone who had been lying in bed thinking about something and could not, in good conscience, leave it until morning. "I want to show you something," she said. He gestured at the chair across from him. She sat and opened the notebook to a page he hadn't seen, toward the back, where she kept things she wasn't ready to share yet. She pushed it across the table to him. On the page, in her careful, unhurried handwriting, she had written a list. Not a list of things to do, a list of things she'd figured out, the way she periodically compiled these, a habit she'd developed entirely on her own that he'd never suggested and had no idea where it came from. He read it. He didn't read it quickly. At the bottom of the list, the last entry, written in slightly larger letters than the others, as if it had arrived with more force. When everyone agrees on the answer, someone still needs to check the question. Underneath it, in smaller letters, added recently by the look of the ink, "Dad taught me this without knowing he was teaching it." He sat with that for a moment. He pushed the notebook back across to her without saying anything, and she pulled it back to her side of the table and closed it, and they sat in the kitchen in the quiet of a house that had been built around the work of staying present in it. "Bed," he said. "I know," she said, and got up and went. He sat at the table for a while after that, with the warm tea and the open legal pad and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary house, and he thought about what it meant to teach a thing without knowing you were teaching it, the knowledge that moved through your hands into the work, the habits that got into the air and were breathed in by the people who lived nearby, the parts of yourself that got passed along not through instruction but through proximity, through watching, through the long accumulation of ordinary days that didn't feel like anything except ordinary until you looked back and saw what they'd added up to. He had not solved the problem of being a person. Nobody did. He still woke up at 3 in the morning sometimes with the specific weight of all the things he hadn't managed, the years he'd been somewhere else when he should have been here, the conversations he'd handled badly, The small failures of patience and attention that accumulated in any life and couldn't be undone, only remembered and carried and tried to do differently next time. He still missed his wife in the way that didn't diminish so much as change shape, fitting itself to the spaces in the life rather than filling them. But he had built something, not the career he'd been on track for, not the version of himself that the engineering world had expected. Something more provisional, more imperfect, more honest about its own limitations. A small shop on Ashford Street, and a consulting arrangement and a 10-year-old who asked better questions than most adults he'd worked with, and who was going to be, by any measure he could apply, genuinely fine. That was not a small thing. He closed the legal pad. He turned off the kitchen light. On the table, he left the old red toolbox, which he'd brought in from the truck because the forecast called for rain, and he didn't like leaving it in wet weather. His father's handwriting on the tape, the dents from the years, the tools inside still doing what tools did when they were used carefully and put away right, lasting longer than anyone expected, being ready when they were needed. He went to bed. The house was quiet. The city was doing what cities do at night. Outside, the April rain had started, soft and steady, the kind that wasn't going anywhere quickly. In her room, Maya had left her notebook open on the nightstand to the page she'd shown him, the light from the street lamp coming through the curtain and lying across it, and the last line sitting there in the dark, the way certain truths sit. Not announced, not dramatized, just present and patient and waiting for whoever was ready to find them. Dad taught me this without knowing he was teaching it, and that, in the end, was the thing. Not the Bugatti, not the alignment tab, or the 5-minute fix, or the unlikely improbability of one man with an old toolbox walking into a room full of experts and finding what they'd missed. Those were the surface of it, the part that made a good story, the part that traveled through professional networks and turned into something larger than it actually was. The real thing was smaller and less dramatic and more durable. It was a father who showed up every day to a small shop on an ordinary street, doing work that paid enough and mattered more than it looked like it did, picking his daughter up at 3:15 because those hours were not negotiable, sitting at a kitchen table after she was asleep with cold tea and a legal pad, thinking carefully about problems that deserved careful thought, passing along without ceremony or announcement the specific quality of attention that turned out to be the most valuable thing he had. It was a 10-year-old who noticed. It was the question underneath the drawing. How does the engine know to start? And everything that lived inside that question, all the curiosity and rigor and refusal to accept the simplified version when the true version was available. It was finally the understanding that the work we do and the lives we build are not separate things, and that the choices we make about one are always, whether we intend it or not, choices we are making about the other. Evan Calder had made his choice years ago. In the worst circumstances, a person can make a consequential decision. Exhausted, grieving, facing a future that looked nothing like the one he'd planned. He'd chosen the life that fit the person he actually was, over the career that fit the person he'd been trying to become. And the life had turned out to be, in its own imperfect and unglamorous and completely sufficient way, the right answer. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was easy or well-recognized or financially optimal, but because it was true, in the specific way that things are true when you stop answering the question everyone is asking and start checking whether that was the right question in the first place. Outside, the rain continued. The city slept. The toolbox sat on his kitchen table, patient and worn and ready.